My name is Maggie. I am 29 years old, and I have fought the hardest battle for my own life. I am battling Hodgkin's lymphoma. But the cancer was not the most toxic thing I had to face. On the day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life, standing at the altar in front of 300 high society guests, my own sister lunged at me and mercilessly ripped my custom bridal wig right off my head. As I stood there, exposed and humiliated beyond all measure, my mother did not rush to my rescue. Instead, she stepped forward with a vicious smirk on her lips and announced to the entire congregation that the groom deserved a real woman, not a bald ghost. She thought it would destroy me. She assumed I would break down in shame, but my family had absolutely no idea what I had prepared for them. Before I get into the rest of this story, let me know in the comments where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. Leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to break you, you will understand exactly what I did. The air inside the historic cathedral, right in the heart of Manhattan, was heavy with the scent of white roses and absurdly expensive perfume. It was the social event of the season, a wedding designed to impress the New York elite and people from the front pages of financial magazines. 300 guests filled the polished oak pews, sporting designer suits and custom-made gowns. Rays of sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass windows, casting vibrant colors onto the marble floor. I stood before the altar, clutching a bouquet of orchids in my hands, trying with all my might to focus on the man standing across from me. Connor was 31 years old. He was a wildly successful director at a Wall Street hedge fund, armed with a charming smile and dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He looked like the picture-perfect groom, pulled straight from the cover of a luxury magazine. I worked as a medical data analyst for a massive Silicon Valley healthcare conglomerate. My life used to be driven by algorithms, hard data, and calm, predictable stability. All of that changed brutally when I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Aggressive chemotherapy saved my life and pushed the disease into remission, but it simultaneously took a monstrous toll on my body. I was painfully thin, my skin had become practically translucent, and I had lost absolutely every single strand of hair on my head. Specifically for the wedding, I bought an unimaginably expensive custom-made bridal wig. It was beautifully styled into soft blonde waves, and a delicate lace veil completed the look. It was supposed to make me feel normal, just for this one day. I wanted to forget about the hospital rooms, the tubes and the IV drips, and simply be a beautiful bride. Standing at the altar, I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. The string quartet had just finished playing, and absolute silence fell over the enormous cathedral. The priest, a dignified older man in festive robes, opened his leather-bound missal. He looked at Connor, then at me, and sent us a warm, reassuring smile. He cleared his throat and began to speak the words of the traditional marriage vows, his voice echoing through the high, vaulted stone ceilings. He reached the crucial moment. He asked Connor if he promised to love me, be faithful and honest, and forsake all others until death do us part, in sickness and in health. Before Connor could even open his mouth to respond, a sudden commotion erupted in the front row. My younger sister Chloe, a 6-year-old self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer, sprang violently to her feet. Chloe was supposed to be my maid of honor, but from the very beginning, she treated my wedding as her own private event for creating social media content. She was wearing a completely inappropriate, revealing emerald gown that she picked out specifically to draw attention away from me. Chloe let out a dramatic, exaggerated gasp, stumbled, and fell forward, claiming her impossibly high stiletto had caught on the hem of her overly long dress, but her movements were far too calculated. She did not fall to the floor. Instead, she lunged aggressively up the altar, stepped straight at me. Her hands shot forward, her fingers hooked like claws. Before I could even process what was happening or take a step back, she grabbed a full handful of my blonde bridal wig. With a violent, brutal jerk, she ripped the wig, along with the pinned veil, right off my head. The physical force of the blow threw my head back, and the sharp bobby pins holding the wig in place scraped painfully across my bare scalp. The beautiful blonde waves, the delicate lace, the entire illusion of normalcy, all of it shattered in a fraction of a second. Chloe jumped back, clutching my wig in her hands, her face contorted in a rehearsed expression of fake shock. A collective gasp of horror swept through the 300 guests. In the cavernous church, the sound was absolutely deafening. People began shifting in their pews, whispering frantically and staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I stood there completely exposed under the bright, unforgiving light of the stained glass. My bare, bald head was on full display for the entire New York elite. The cool air hit my scalp, a painful reminder of my illness and the monstrous months of chemotherapy I had barely survived. My hands were shaking as I gripped my bouquet, my knuckles turning white from the tension. I waited for someone to intervene. I waited for the priest to say anything to restore order. But above all, I waited for my mother to rush toward me, shield me, and protect her sick daughter from this public humiliation. But Catherine, my own mother, did no such thing. She was a woman obsessed with social status, appearances, and maintaining a flawless public image. She always treated my illness not as a tragedy where I needed support, but as an ugly inconvenience that ruined her perfect family portrait. She slowly stood up from the front pew. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk designer suit, completely unfazed by the chaos her daughter had just caused, and walked slowly to the very edge of the altar. She looked at me, trembling and stripped of my remaining dignity. There was not an ounce of pity in her eyes. Instead, she smiled viciously. "The groom deserves a real woman," she announced loudly, "not a bald ghost." Her cruel words hung in the cathedral air, bouncing off the brick vaults and settling over the congregation like a thick, suffocating blanket. The 300 guests held their breath as one. Absolutely every single pair of eyes shifted from my triumphant mother to the man standing right across from me, to Connor, my handsome, seemingly devoted groom. The man who promised to stand by my side through the darkest, most terrifying valleys of my oncology diagnosis. The man who was supposed to be my fierce protector. I looked into his eyes, waiting for the righteous anger I thought I would see there. I waited for him to take a step forward to shield my exposed head from the glaring light, to berate my mother and sister for this grotesque display of cruelty. I waited for him to pull me to his chest and announce to the entire room that he loved me exactly the way I was. But the warmth in his eyes was gone forever. In its place appeared a blood-curdling, undeniable disgust. Connor stared at my bare head as if he were looking at a monster. The color drained from his face, leaving his normally sun-kissed skin a sickly ashen hue. His jaw dropped, and that charming smile that had once stolen my heart evaporated, giving way to a grimace of pure revulsion. Slowly, with full premeditation, he tore his hands away from my grip. That physical gesture of withdrawal was so sharp, so brutally rejecting, that it hurt more than the moment my sister ripped my wig off. He wiped the insides of his palms on the sides of his perfectly tailored tuxedo pants, literally treating my touch as if my illness were a contagious plague he desperately needed to wash off. A heavy, tearing silence engulfed the church. The only sound was the soft rustle of silk and the uncomfortable shifting of the Manhattan elite waiting for the groom to do anything to salvage the ceremony. Instead, Connor took a step back, creating a physical distance between us. He stared at the marble floor, completely unable to meet my eyes. The beautiful illusion of our relationship was crumbling before my eyes, leaving nothing behind but the ugly truth of his cowardice. "I am sorry," he mumbled. His voice was weak, barely audible, and yet it echoed in the silent cathedral. He did not say it to me. He did not even look at me. He addressed the guests in the front row, looking specifically at his wealthy parents and my vindictive mother, searching their eyes for approval of his act of abandonment. "I cannot do this," Connor stuttered, shaking his head and taking another large step backward. "I just cannot do this. I am so sorry." With those pathetic, cowardly words on his lips, he simply turned his back on me. He did not run, but his steps were quick and decisive as he descended the altar steps, passing my mother, passing my sister, and heading straight down the main aisle toward the heavy oak doors of the church. The man I was supposed to marry was retreating like a coward, leaving his sick, humiliated bride completely alone in front of hundreds of staring onlookers. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him with a dull thud, sealing his decision once and for all. A quiet, frantic murmur erupted among the crowd. Whispers hissed between the rows of pews like venomous snakes. I saw pity flashing in the eyes of my distant relatives, their faces contorted in expressions of horrific shame at what had just happened. I also saw the thinly veiled amusement on the faces of my mother's snobbish country club friends, women who fed on the misery of others. They were watching a disaster unfold in real time. They were absolutely convinced I was about to break down. They expected my legs to give out, for me to collapse onto the cold marble and melt into a puddle of hysterical, heartbreaking sobs. They waited for the sick, abandoned woman to cry over her ruined wedding day, begging someone to save her. But not a single tear welled up in my eyes. My heart, which had been beating wildly just a moment ago, suddenly calmed down, shifting into a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly steady beat. The panic that should have consumed me evaporated entirely, leaving behind a deep, icy clarity of mind that sharpened every single detail in that room. The crisp air hitting my bare scalp was no longer a humiliation. I felt as if I were going through a baptism. It was a feeling of total and absolute freedom. I slowly lowered my gaze to the floor. Lying there on the polished light stone rested my custom-made blonde wig. The delicate lace was slightly torn where Chloe's manicured claws had aggressively ripped it. The synthetic waves looked completely out of place on the cold ground, nothing more than a discarded remnant of a fragile facade I had been forced to maintain purely for their comfort. With absolute unhurried grace, I leaned down. The heavy silk of my wedding dress rustled softly in the silent church as I squatted, reached out, and picked up the wig, feeling the cheap texture of the artificial hair under my fingers. I stood back up, my posture perfectly straight. I pulled my shoulder blades back with intense, unwavering pride, holding the wig in my hand. Gently and methodically, I dusted off the invisible dirt from its strands, showing not an ounce of shame. I looked at my mother. Catherine stood just a few steps away from me. Her vicious smirk faltered slightly when she failed to see the devastation she so desperately wanted to cause. I looked at Chloe, who was still standing by the altar steps, her face twisted in a mix of fake shock and genuine confusion at my complete lack of a nervous breakdown. And then I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a smile of forgiveness or acceptance. It was a blood-curdling, razor-sharp curl of the lips that held no warmth and no mercy. It was the smile of an apex predator who just realized the door to its cage had been left wide open. My family thought they had orchestrated a perfect public execution. They believed they had successfully cornered a weak, dying woman and stripped her of her last shreds of dignity. They thought this highly public humiliation would be my tragic end. How incredibly wrong they were. This was not a tragedy. This was my green light. For weeks I had silently endured their cruelty, hoarding their dark secrets and meticulously laying a web of invisible, devastating financial traps. I desperately needed a catalyst, a public, undeniable deal-breaker, to activate the absolute ruin I had designed for them. By ripping off my wig, publicly mocking my illness, and making Connor cowardly abandon me at the altar, they had just handed me the detonator. Every single element of my master plan was just set in motion. They swallowed the hook perfectly, stepping right into the line of fire. I stood completely bald in the glare of the cathedral lights, holding my ruined wig, feeling nothing but an exhilarating, dangerous anticipation for the absolute destruction that was about to rain down on their heads. The whispers in the cathedral grew louder, forming a buzzing hive of gossip that I knew would circle all of New York City by dusk. Let them whisper. Let them spread the story of the broken bride. They were completely oblivious to the fact that my tears had dried up months ago. The sick, vulnerable girl they allegedly destroyed was already dead, and her place had been taken by a woman who refused to be a victim. The game had finally begun. The foundations of my revenge were poured exactly 3 months prior to this moment at the altar. The memory of how this war truly started pulled my attention away from the whispering crowd in the church and transported me back to the sterile, unforgiving walls of the oncology ward. 3 months earlier, I was not wearing custom-tailored silk, nor was I holding a bridal bouquet. I was tethered to a cold steel IV pole in a freezing hospital room, going through one of the most grueling and aggressive chemotherapy sessions in my entire treatment plan. The rhythmic, monotonous beeping of the heart monitor and the slow, steady drip of toxic yet life-saving chemicals into my veins were the only sounds keeping me company. My body felt like it was made of solid lead, and every single muscle ached with a deep, bone-penetrating exhaustion. My skin was pale and downright translucent under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, serving as living proof of the massive physical toll Hodgkin's lymphoma was taking on my system. I stared blankly at the ceiling tiles, desperately trying to distract myself from the monstrous nausea twisting my stomach, clinging to the foolish hope that maybe someone from my family would actually show up to offer even a shred of comfort or support. The heavy wooden door to my room suddenly swung open with a loud, abrasive slam. That grating noise sent a sharp spike of pain straight through my throbbing head. I weakly turned toward the entrance, fully expecting a nurse coming in to check my vitals or adjust my medication flow. Instead, my mother, Catherine, and younger sister, Chloe, marched into the sterile room. They looked as if they had just stepped off a high society runway, completely out of place in a hospital wing dedicated to the severely ill. Catherine was dressed in a perfectly tailored beige designer trench coat. She had a luxury leather handbag slung over her forearm, and her posture was perfectly rigid and commanding. Chloe strutted right behind her, busy adjusting the strap of her oversized, obscenely expensive sunglasses, totally absorbed in checking her reflection on her phone screen. There were no colorful bouquets of flowers in their hands. They did not bring warm coffee or a soft blanket, they did not wear sympathetic smiles, and they spoke absolutely no words of encouragement. The grim reality of the hospital environment seemed to be entirely beneath them. Catherine did not even bother to ask how I was feeling. She did not step up to the edge of the mattress to hold my hand, nor did she offer any gentle maternal gesture. She marched straight to the side of my bed and reached her perfectly manicured hand into her expensive leather bag. She pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents clipped together. Without the slightest hesitation or even a word of greeting, she threw the heavy gray folder right onto my lap. The paper slid slightly, resting heavily on the thin, scratchy hospital blanket covering my weak legs. I stared at the bold, black lettering printed in all caps at the very top of the first page. It was a quitclaim deed transferring property ownership. My chemo-fogged brain struggled to comprehend what exactly I was looking at. I looked at my mother with an incredibly dry throat, expecting some logical explanation. Catherine crossed her arms tightly over her chest and presented her demands with the blood-curdling, ruthless efficiency of a corporate shark liquidating bankrupt assets. Without beating around the bush, she demanded I sign the papers and sign over the rights to my luxury, fully paid-off penthouse in downtown Manhattan. It was an incredibly expensive piece of real estate in a high-rise, boasting panoramic views of the city skyline, an asset I had purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money from years of working 12-hour days as a medical data analyst. Catherine looked down at my pale, sickly face and rationalized her demand with a calculated coldness that instantly froze the blood in my veins. She stated, completely devoid of any human emotion, that my medical treatments were threatening to entirely drain the family's financial resources, conveniently ignoring the fact that I was paying for my private health care completely on my own. Then she looked me dead in the eye and uttered a sentence that was meant to sever our relationship forever. She told me that I was probably not going to live much longer anyway, and holding on to a multi-million-dollar property while I was dying was a selfish and irresponsible waste. Chloe finally managed to tear her eyes away from her phone screen to add her 2 cents, fully agreeing with this horrifying, deeply disturbing assessment made by our mother. My younger sister stepped closer to the hospital bed, wrinkling her nose and complaining about the harsh lighting in the room. She sighed dramatically and explained that her career as a lifestyle influencer was supposedly on the verge of a massive, incredibly lucrative breakthrough. According to Chloe, she desperately needed a proper headquarters from which to record her daily content, host important meetings with brand reps, and project the wealthy, success-driven image required to grow her online following. My beautiful modern penthouse in the heart of the city was exactly the backdrop she needed to secure those lucrative brand deals. They convinced themselves, and expected me to agree, that seizing my home was not theft at all, but a necessary strategic business maneuver designed to save the family from the imaginary burden of my supposedly impending medical debts. Lying there in that stiff hospital bed, I felt that the chemical poison dripping directly into my arm was far less toxic than the two women standing over me. They were not looking at a daughter or a sister, fighting a terrifying, painful battle with cancer. They were looking at a dying woman exclusively as a prime real estate acquisition opportunity. They wanted me to literally sign away my sanctuary, my financial safety net, and my entire life's work, just so Chloe could have a pretty background for her internet videos. Catherine began impatiently tapping a silver pen against the plastic edge of my hospital tray table, demanding my signature immediately so they could file the paperwork before the county clerk's office closed for the weekend. Their sheer audacity, their absolute blood-curdling lack of empathy, destroyed any remaining foolish, naive illusions I still harbored about my family. That was the exact moment my sadness died, transforming into a cold, unbreakable determination to survive and to destroy them. The sharp tapping of the silver pen against the plastic hospital table sounded like a countdown to an explosion. Catherine leaned closer, her designer perfume clashing brutally with the sterile scent of antiseptic. She shoved the deed toward my chest, her flawlessly manicured nail pressing into the paper, exactly where she expected me to sign away my life's achievements. Chloe stood right next to her with crossed arms, probably already planning exactly where to hang her vanity mirrors in my living room. I stared at that pen, my vision blurred from the chemo. I was completely paralyzed by the pure evil radiating from my own flesh and blood. Just as Catherine opened her mouth to issue another venomous demand, the heavy wooden door to the hospital room burst open. Marcus crossed the threshold and stopped dead in his tracks. He was 32 years old. He was an incredibly sharp African-American man who worked as a high-end forensic auditor for a massive Wall Street firm. Unfortunately for him, he was also Chloe's husband. Tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he clutched a worn leather briefcase in his hand. His warm, intelligent eyes darted from the legal documents resting on my lap to the silver pen in Catherine's hand, and finally to Chloe's completely pathetic expression. It took him less than 3 seconds to perfectly analyze the nonsense going down in here. As a forensic auditor, he made a living analyzing discrepancies and tracking down financial predators. He did not need a spreadsheet to see the disgusting extortion taking place in this hospital room. His facial expression shifted from initial confusion to absolute blinding disgust. With a dull thud, he dropped his briefcase onto the visitor's chair. Before Catherine could even formulate a lie, Marcus crossed the room in 3 long strides, reached out, and with one violent motion, snatched the deed right off my blanket. His movements were fast, decisive, and fueled by righteous anger that instantly flipped the power dynamic in the room. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to the pearls at her neck in a dramatic, exaggerated gesture of fake outrage. She demanded he explain what he thought he was doing, claiming this was private family business. Marcus did not give an inch. He crushed the thick stack of documents in his large hand, the sound of tearing paper slicing through the thick silence. He looked his mother-in-law dead in the eye and told her that extorting a cancer patient to sign over real estate is not family business. It is a felony. Chloe immediately stepped forward to defend her mother, her voice pitching into a whiny register. She tried to grab her husband's arm, whining something about her influencer career and how much they needed the penthouse for her brand deals. Marcus looked at his wife with a mix of deep pity and intense revulsion. He shook her hand off his arm as if her touch burned him. He extended a finger and pointed straight at the open door. His voice was dangerously low, carrying a lethal authority that commanded absolute obedience. He told them both to get the hell out of my room immediately. Catherine tried to stand her ground, puffing out her chest and threatening to call hospital security. Marcus countered without blinking. He offered to call the police himself and show them the forcefully seized deed they tried to make a heavily medicated patient sign. That instantly shut Catherine's mouth. Her bravado evaporated, replaced by a panicked awareness of her own criminal liability. She grabbed her designer handbag, turned on her heel, and marched out into the hallway. Chloe hurried after her, throwing a disgusting tantrum on the way out. Marcus followed his wife into the brightly lit hospital corridor. For the next 5 minutes, I sat in bed, listening to a muffled but incredibly vicious argument that echoed through the thick drywall. I heard Chloe screaming about how he never supported her dreams and how he was sabotaging her future. I also heard Marcus's deep, booming voice cutting through her hysteria, announcing that he refused to be the husband of a parasite feeding off her own dying sister. The pure finality in his tone sent a shockwave down the hall. The rapid clicking of stilettos eventually faded away down the corridor as Catherine and Chloe retreated in absolute defeat. The hospital door creaked slowly, and Marcus stepped back inside. He looked exhausted, aggressively rubbing his face with his hand. He walked over to the door handle, turned the heavy lock, and locked us in from the inside. The solid click gave me an immediate, unexpected sense of safety. He walked back to his chair, picked up his leather briefcase, and placed it on his lap. The anger completely melted from his face, giving way to a deeply unsettling professional seriousness. He apologized to me for the horrible scene, assuring me that my apartment was safe and that he personally would shred the document. But then his eyes darkened. He said that Chloe and Catherine were not the reason he rushed to the oncology ward today. Marcus popped the brass latches on his briefcase, reached inside, and pulled out a thick, highly classified audit file whose edges were heavily worn from constant review. The file bore bright red stamps warning of confidentiality. He placed it gently on the edge of my hospital table, treating it literally like an armed explosive device. 2 years ago, before I even got my diagnosis, I founded a national charitable foundation aimed at helping children from low-income families with cancer pay for experimental treatments. It was my life's project, an organization I poured my whole heart into. When I got sick, I was forced to step back from daily operations, leaving administrative control to the board. Marcus looked at me with a grim, unyielding expression. He explained that a few weeks ago, he noticed a strange discrepancy in his own household finances, specifically a massive influx of cash into Chloe's personal bank accounts. Suspecting the worst, he quietly used his forensic auditing credentials to trace the routing numbers and backtrace to the source of those transfers. He tapped his index finger on the classified file. He warned me to prepare for the worst. He uncovered a massive, unimaginably dark financial anomaly. The money flooding his wife's bank account did not come from brand deals or sponsors. It was being systematically and illegally siphoned directly from the pediatric cancer foundation I had built myself. My own family was embezzling funds and donations meant for dying children, and Marcus had brought all the paperwork to prove it. I stared at the thick gray folder lying on my table, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my fragile ribs. The sheer scale of this betrayal was utterly paralyzing. It was one thing for a mother and sister to try to steal my private apartment while I was incapacitated by chemotherapy, but it was an entirely different thing, from a totally different universe of depravity, to steal life-saving funds meant for sick, vulnerable children. Marcus opened the file, flipping through dozens of highlighted bank statements, forged withdrawal slips, and wire transfer logs. He explained the mechanics of the fraud to me with cold, clinical precision. Catherine, using the emergency power of attorney I so foolishly granted her when my cancer began advancing aggressively, gained access to the foundation's main operating accounts. Instead of managing the funds intended for pediatric wards, which she was legally obligated to do, she set up a complex web of shell company accounts. She wrote checks for phantom medical supplies and funneled pure cash back into her own pocket and Chloe's personal checking accounts. Marcus warned me that because my name was still listed as the primary founder and president of the foundation, I could be held criminally liable by the Department of Justice if this embezzlement was discovered by an external audit. They were not just stealing money, they were unknowingly framing me to take the fall for this major federal white-collar crime. The locked hospital room suddenly felt like a shrinking cage, and the full, terrifying weight of my family's betrayal finally crushed the last remaining shreds of my naivety. The horrifying discovery in that hospital room forever altered the trajectory of my existence, but the true depth of my family's depravity only fully hit me a few weeks before the wedding. I was discharged from the oncology ward and was resting in the exact same downtown penthouse my mother tried to steal from me. Marcus and I were secretly working in the shadows, building a fortress of evidence against Catherine and Chloe. I was physically weak, spending most days wrapped in thick blankets, but my mind was sharper than ever before. I was just about to begin a highly specialized, life-saving experimental therapy. This new immunotherapy represented the crucial final step in my treatment protocol, designed to completely eradicate the remaining microscopic traces of Hodgkin's lymphoma and guarantee my long-term survival. It was my ultimate light in this incredibly dark, agonizing tunnel. I was sitting on the living room sofa, sipping hot ginger tea to settle my constantly churning stomach. When my phone vibrated on the glass coffee table, the screen displayed the name of my lead oncology coordinator from the research clinic. I answered immediately, expecting a routine call confirming my admission date for the trial. Instead, the voice on the other end was tense with professional concern. The coordinator took a deep breath and informed me that a catastrophic issue had arisen with my paperwork. She stated that my premium private insurance provider had suddenly refused to cover any costs of the experimental immunotherapy. That in itself was shocking, as my policy was top tier and covered absolutely everything. But the coordinator did not stop there. She explained that the hospital's billing department tried to charge the initial down payment from the deductible required to secure my spot in the trial program. The automatic transfer was declined. The transaction was blocked by my bank due to insufficient funds in the account. My fingers gripped the ceramic mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. I told the coordinator this had to be some system error. For years, I had meticulously managed my finances, maintaining a robust checking account dedicated solely to covering any unexpected medical expenses. I assured her I would contact the bank immediately to clear up the hold and wire the funds directly by the end of the business day. I hung up, and my heart suddenly began pounding against my ribs in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I grabbed my laptop from the side table and hurriedly opened my web browser. My hands were shaking so violently that it took me 3 tries to type in the online banking address. I entered my secure login credentials, navigating directly to my main checking account and standard savings account. The screen refreshed, loading the interface. I stared at the numbers displayed on the glowing monitor, and the breath caught in my throat. The balances had been completely wiped out. Accounts that just a few days ago held tens of thousands of dollars now showed 2-digit figures. An overwhelming, blood-curdling panic rose in my throat. This was not a minor banking error. My physical survival was suddenly hanging by a thread. Without those funds, I would lose my spot in the clinical trial, which would leave me completely defenseless against a deadly cancer relapse. I clicked on the transaction history, scanning the ledger with horror. Over the past 48 hours, a lightning-fast, methodical series of transfers had been executed for the maximum allowable amount. The money was systematically drained and wired to offshore accounts whose routing numbers I did not recognize at all. I felt all the air leave me. For a split second, I slammed the laptop shut, fighting the urge to vomit, but I could not afford a breakdown. I still had my emergency reserves. Years ago, I set up a completely separate, high-yield investment portfolio with a different brokerage firm. That was my ultimate safety net. A locked vault of capital intended for catastrophic emergencies exactly like this. I reopened the laptop, typing in the investment firm's web address. I quickly typed my username and complex, multi-character password. I clicked the login button, waiting for the system to grant me access so I could liquidate the necessary assets and save my own life. A bright red error message flashed on the screen. Access denied. Invalid login credentials. I frowned, assuming my trembling fingers had simply hit the wrong key. I carefully typed the password again, checking every letter and number. I hit enter again. The same bright red error message appeared again, mocking my rising panic. I clicked the password recovery link, entering my personal email address to receive reset instructions. The system returned a prompt, informing me that the primary email address linked to the account had recently been changed. I was asked to answer backup security questions to verify my identity. The first question loaded on the screen. What was the name of your first pet? I typed the answer. The system rejected it. I tried the second question. What city did your parents meet in? I typed the answer. Rejected. A deep, paralyzing terror washed over me in a split second, followed closely by a wave of pure, untainted fury. Security questions had been changed. The backup email was hijacked. Passwords were completely altered. I had been entirely locked out of my entire life's savings. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. I had been financially sabotaged from the inside. I knew exactly who had the capability to carry out destruction on this scale: Catherine. I had rushed to revoke her power of attorney when Marcus warned me, but I underestimated her speed. Before the financial institutions processed the cancellation request, she used the document as a weapon. Catherine walked into a bank branch, presented the notarized paperwork granting her total authority over my affairs, and systematically cut me off from my wealth. The sheer weight of this discovery should have destroyed me. It should have pushed me into an abyss of hopeless despair, making me cry over my stolen future and inevitable doom. Instead, a terrifying, unnatural calm washed over me. I did not scream. I did not throw my laptop at the wall. I simply reached across the glass table and pulled Marcus's worn leather briefcase toward me. If Catherine wanted to play a financial war, using my life as collateral, then she severely underestimated the woman she was trying to bury. By trade, I was a medical data analyst. My entire career was built on spotting anomalies, deciphering complex systems, and tracking impossible patterns. They locked the front door to my own finances, but Marcus had just handed me the master key to their back doors. I opened the classified audit file that Marcus had compiled while risking his own career. The red confidentiality stamps glared back at me, a stark reminder of the felony crime being committed under the guise of family management. For the next 14 hours, I dove into the dark web of my own financial ruin. I cross-referenced the routing numbers Marcus had flagged with the public records of my pediatric cancer foundation. I bypassed standard banking portals, using back-end verification tools I had mastered in my analytical work to trace the phantom accounts set up by Catherine. The deeper I dug, the more disgusting the picture became. Raw data does not lie, and it painted a portrait of greed so grotesque it defied human comprehension. The total amount was an even $600,000. That was the exact sum Catherine systematically embezzled from the Foundation's relief fund in just 2 months. She used the notarized power of attorney to authorize massive wire transfers, masking them as operational costs and emergency medical grants, but that money was not going to dying children. I followed the digital breadcrumbs straight to the recipient accounts. The first massive chunk of stolen foundation funds was wired to a luxury car dealership. Chloe, my vain, mindless sister who just recently stood in my hospital room complaining about my alleged medical debt, was now driving a brand new, fully loaded Porsche Macan. She literally bought her dream car with money that was meant to keep kids with cancer alive. The remaining funds were just as easy to track. Catherine did not bother to sophisticatedly cover her tracks, assuming my impending death would simply erase all evidence. Tens of thousands of dollars were pumped directly into an exclusive country club for the elite. My mother was secretly drowning in massive social debts, desperately trying to maintain her facade of wealth among her high society friends. She paid off overdue membership dues, covered tabs for months of extravagant dinners, and even booked exclusive event spaces using stolen cash. They sipped vintage champagne and revved the engine of a German sports car, while I was being denied entry to a life-saving clinical trial due to insufficient funds. The instinct to grab my phone and dial 911 was overwhelming. I wanted to drag them out of their wealthy lives in handcuffs. I wanted to watch the authorities impound that Porsche and publicly escort Catherine out of her precious country club, but I held back. A confrontation right now, or notifying law enforcement prematurely, would give them a chance to panic, destroy evidence, or spin a narrative about a huge misunderstanding. If I struck now, I might recover the money, but I would not achieve total destruction. I realized that my silence was the most lethal weapon I possessed. As long as they believed I was a dying, clueless victim, blindly trusting their management, they would remain careless. They would keep spending, keep stealing, and keep digging their own graves. I decided to use my silence as my most powerful weapon. However, before I could enact my revenge, I had a much more pressing problem to solve. I had to guarantee my spot in the experimental immunotherapy trial, and I needed millions of dollars to secure my long-term survival and fund my retaliation. Catherine thought she stripped me of all valuable assets by targeting my real estate and liquid cash. However, she was completely unaware of the intellectual property I owned. Before my diagnosis, I had spent 3 years building a proprietary medical data algorithm designed to predict patient treatment outcomes based on microscopic genetic markers. It was a revolutionary piece of software that my former employer desperately wanted to acquire, but I retained full, exclusive ownership rights to it. I reached out directly to the CEO of a rival healthcare tech giant in Silicon Valley, a man who had been trying to buy my algorithm for years. The negotiations were lightning fast, absolutely ruthless, and conducted completely in secret. I bypassed standard corporate acquisition channels, demanding an expedited, confidential intellectual property transfer in exchange for a massive, immediate cash buyout. Knowing the immense market value of the code, the CEO agreed within a matter of hours. The documents were signed digitally, and the transaction was finalized at breakneck speed. I did not deposit those proceeds into any account Catherine knew existed. I routed $140 million to an offshore, completely untraceable shell company I set up in Delaware under a fictitious name. From this anonymous entity, I wired the required down payment directly to the research clinic, securing my spot in the experimental trial with an ironclad confidentiality clause. My health and survival were officially guaranteed. My mother and sister were completely unaware that the sick, penniless woman they so eagerly planned to bury had just become richer and more powerful than they could ever imagine. With my physical future secured and endless resources at my disposal, I began laying the intricate, invisible cables of a bulletproof financial trap, ready to let them walk right into their own absolute ruin. There were only 2 weeks left until the big wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral. 2 weeks until the moment I was to walk down the marble aisle and join my life with Connor in front of 300 high society guests. It was also the day of my last scheduled chemotherapy session before transitioning to the experimental immunotherapy I had just secretly funded. The chemical cocktail pumped into my veins that morning was exceptionally brutal. A wave of paralyzing nausea hit me midway through the drip, causing my vision to gray out and my stomach to twist into tight, painful knots. My body violently rejected the treatment, leaving me shivering under a thin hospital blanket. The nurses, alarmed by my sudden blood pressure spike and horrific pallor, decided to stop the IV early. They gave me a horse dose of anti-nausea meds and advised me to head straight home to rest. I ordered a cab and rode back to my downtown penthouse in silence, staring out the window at the bustling streets of Manhattan. Physically, I felt like an empty, fragile shell of myself, but mentally, I was operating on a level of pure, razor-sharp clarity. I spent the last few weeks secretly moving my new fortune, creating airtight legal structures, and quietly observing my family's oblivious greed. I impatiently waited for the absolute silence of my home, a place where I could simply close my eyes and breathe without having to put on a theatrical performance for anyone. I slid my key into the front door lock, turning it with practiced soundlessness. I stepped into the foyer, gently pushing the heavy oak door behind me until it clicked securely. I slipped off my flats, wanting nothing more than to walk quietly to my bedroom and just collapse on the bed. But as I stepped across the polished hardwood floors, a sound made me freeze in my tracks. It was a soft, muffled laugh, coming down the hall from the main living room. My penthouse should have been empty. I lived alone, and Connor was supposedly at his office finalizing projects for a key investor. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This was not the hum of a TV left on. This was the distinct, intimate sound of two people sharing a private moment. I crept forward, pressing my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. I moved with agonizing slowness, my feet in only stockings gliding silently across the floor. I reached the wide, arched entryway to the living room and carefully peeked around the edge of the wall. The afternoon sun streamed in, casting bright, warm light onto my custom Italian leather sofa. And right there, bathed in sunlight in my own home, were two intensely and unmistakably entangled silhouettes. The breath caught in my throat. It was Chloe. My younger sister was practically straddling the man I was supposed to marry in exactly 14 days, Connor, my devoted, supposedly heartbroken fiancé, whose hands gripped her waist with an aggressive and sickening familiarity. The same sister whose husband Marcus had just risked his career and freedom to defend me in the hospital ward. They were kissing passionately, their bodies pressed together in a disgusting display of complete betrayal. The old Maggie would have gasped for air, started screaming, dropped her purse, and collapsed in a puddle of tears and total devastation right there in the hallway. She would have demanded answers, begged for explanations, and allowed her heart to shatter into a million irreversible pieces. But the old Maggie died the day Catherine threw the quitclaim deed onto her hospital bed. The new Maggie, fueled by absolute mental clarity and $140 million of untraceable funds, felt absolutely no heartbreak. I only felt the cold, calculated thrill of an apex predator that had just spotted its prey. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I instantly silenced all notifications. I dropped the volume to 0 and opened the camera app. I hit the red record button. Holding the device perfectly still around the edge of the archway, I began recording their grotesque masquerade on high-definition video. Connor broke the kiss, tucking a strand of Chloe's blonde hair behind her ear. He let out a long, heavy groan, tilting his head back against the sofa cushions. Chloe giggled, tracing her manicured nail along his jawline. She pouted and asked him how much longer he had to play the devoted, tragic groom. Connor sighed, rubbing his face in feigned exhaustion. He complained bitterly to my sister about the sheer burden of our relationship, and then he spoke the words that would forever seal his fate in my grand plan. He told Chloe he could barely stand the sight of me. He called me his dying fiancé, a repulsive, bald ghost. He whined about how disgusting it was to touch my frail, sickly body, shuddering with exaggerated disgust as he mentioned having to hold my hand in public just to maintain the illusion of a loyal partner. He told her that every time he had to kiss me on the cheek, he was forced to hold his breath. Chloe did not slap him. She did not stand up for her sick sister. Instead, she purred in approval, leaning in to kiss his neck. She whispered that he only had to endure it a little while longer. She reminded him of the ultimate prize. The cathedral wedding had to happen, so they could formalize the legal ties in the eyes of the public before my inevitable demise. Once we were married, and I was in the ground, Connor would legally inherit everything Catherine had not managed to steal through her fraudulent schemes at the foundation. They were conspiring to divide my life, my assets, and my legacy among themselves, like vultures feeding on fresh carrion. I kept recording, capturing every vile syllable, every heartless insult, and every undeniable frame of their betrayal. My stomach rose to my throat, but the physical nausea from the chemo was completely replaced by a rush of cold, clinical adrenaline. This was not a tragedy unfolding before my eyes. This was pure, unassailable bargaining power. Marcus had already warned me about Chloe's financial crimes, but now I held the perfect weapon to destroy her personal life and utterly level Connor's pristine reputation as a golden boy. I saw and heard exactly what I needed. I tapped the screen to stop recording, ensuring the video file was securely saved and automatically backed up to my newly encrypted cloud server. I quietly backed away from the archway in the living room, retreating down the long hallway with the same caution with which I had approached it. I gently pushed open the heavy front door, slipped out into the stairwell, and closed it behind me with a soft, undetectable click. I stood alone in the hallway outside my penthouse, clutching my phone tightly to my chest. The ultimate weapon of mass destruction was loaded and ready to fire. They thought I was a fragile, bald ghost just waiting to die. They had no idea they were already haunting a graveyard they built by their own design. Standing in the quiet, carpeted hallway outside my front door, I pulled my wireless earbuds from my coat pocket and put them in my ears. My hands were remarkably steady, completely devoid of the tremors that usually accompanied a fresh dose of chemo. I unlocked my phone and fired up the high-definition video file I had just recorded. The audio flowed straight into my ears, crisp and undeniably incriminating. I watched the screen intently, observing the footage of Connor pulling Chloe closer to him on the cushions of my own couch. This was the last 30 seconds of the clip, captured right as I was slowly backing away toward the front door, the moment that provided the ultimate, crushing motive. Connor's voice cracked in the recording, but not under the weight of grief or the exhaustion of caring for a sick partner. It cracked with a frantic, desperate greed. He rested his forehead against my sister's shoulder and confessed the ugly truth about his flawless, highly acclaimed hedge fund. It wasn't just struggling in a tough market. It was in total, irreversible freefall. A series of catastrophic, highly leveraged bets on volatile tech startups had pushed his firm to the brink of absolute collapse. His wealthy, demanding investors were circling his office like bloodthirsty sharks, demanding quarterly returns he simply did not have. He admitted to Chloe that he was mere days away from total financial ruin, absolute professional disgrace, and potential federal indictments from the Securities and Exchange Commission for criminal negligence in managing client capital. And then came the sickening punchline, the revelation that sealed his doom. Connor looked deep into Chloe's eyes and promised her their terrifying financial nightmare was almost over. He stated plainly, without a shadow of hesitation or remorse, that he was going through with this grand cathedral wedding solely to secure ironclad legal status as my primary heir. The prize was not my undying love, nor my real estate portfolio. It was my life insurance policy worth $12 million. He cold-bloodedly calculated the timeline of my illness, telling Chloe my aggressive cancer would surely finish me off within 6 months of the ceremony. The moment the massive insurance payout hit the account, he planned to immediately liquidate his failing firm, snatch the $12 million in pure cash, and flee with my sister to some luxurious offshore haven where they could live out their twisted, parasitic fantasy. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, staring at the polished brass numbers on the door of my penthouse. My eyes did not fill with tears. I did not gasp dramatically. I did not feel an ounce of regret. The last remnants of affection I held for the man I supposedly loved evaporated, replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor. I simply turned on my heel and walked down the long, quiet corridor toward the elevators. I pressed the call button. I rode the mirrored cab down to the ground floor lobby and walked out through the revolving glass doors into the crisp, biting New York air. The bustling city rushed around me. Businessmen checked their watches, couriers hurried past, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire personal life had just detonated and burned to the ground right before my eyes. But that explosion did not leave me buried in rubble and ash. It forged me into something completely indestructible. I hailed a passing yellow cab. I slid into the back seat, smelling of worn leather, and immediately dialed a number I had recently memorized. Marcus answered on the second ring. His deep voice carried the exhausted, gravelly tone of a man who had spent the last few days systematically dismantling his own toxic marriage to my sister. I didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I needed his top-tier forensic accounting skills immediately. I quickly and precisely relayed the video recording, Connor's disgusting confession and the imminent, catastrophic collapse of his highly leveraged hedge fund. Marcus listened in absolute silence, absorbing the sheer scale of the betrayal unfolding around us. When I finished describing the plot to extort $12 million in life insurance, Marcus let out a low, humorless laugh, noting that my family truly possessed a bottomless, unprecedented capacity for evil. I leaned forward toward the clear plastic partition in the taxi and outlined the blueprint for my immediate counterattack. Thanks to the massive, untraceable influx of cash I secured from the sale of my proprietary medical algorithm to the tech giant, I possessed exactly the kind of liquid capital Connor was so desperately praying for. I had absolutely no intention of throwing him a lifeline, though. I instructed Marcus to activate the anonymous offshore shell company registered in Delaware that we set up together earlier that week, operating completely in the shadows. Safely behind the veil of encrypted corporate barriers and proxy board members, we were going to become Connor's worst nightmare. I gave Marcus the green light to aggressively buy up every single scrap of toxic, defaulting debt tied to Connor's sinking fund. I wanted my holding company to purchase the secured loans his firm couldn't pay, scooping them up for pennies on the dollar from his panicked, fleeing institutional creditors. While we spoke, I could hear Marcus's fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard, rapidly pulling public financial statements and hidden ledgers from my fiancé's firm. He confirmed Connor's debt was bleeding bright red, and his current creditors were desperate to offload this junk paper to anyone willing to take on the massive risk. By buying out this toxic debt, my anonymous shell company would instantly become Connor's largest, most aggressive, and utterly ruthless creditor. Legally, he would owe me his entire professional existence, without even knowing my real name. He believed he was marrying a frail, dying woman for an easy $12 million payout and an escape with her sister. He had absolutely no clue he was legally tying himself to the exact corporate entity that was quietly buying the rights to his total destruction. Marcus confirmed the massive wire transfers were initiated through our secure servers, snatching up blocks of debt one by one. The financial trap was perfectly set, its steel jaws ready to snap shut in the exact same fraction of a second. Connor stood at the altar, and spoke his vows. The days leading up to the ceremony at St. Patrick's evaporated in a quiet, focused blur of behind-the-scenes orchestration. Marcus and I seamlessly finalized the hostile takeover of Connor's toxic hedge fund debt, securing the financial snare under the impenetrable veil of my offshore holding company, while my mother, sister, and fiancé spent their days smiling brightly during floral arrangement selections and champagne tastings, completely oblivious to the noose tightening around their necks. I spent my time in silence, ensuring the trap would snap with lethal precision. And then came the night before the wedding. The rehearsal dinner was not an intimate family gathering. It was a highly publicized, heavily photographed social event. Connor's parents, stiff elites with generational wealth who viewed our marriage primarily as a highly beneficial PR merger for their son's pristine corporate image, rented out an entire private mezzanine in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Flashes from local society photographers popped near the brass-handled entrance, capturing the arrival of our elite guests. I arrived wearing a floor-length, custom-tailored white silk gown, a stunning, delicate creation I ordered months before a cancer diagnosis ever entered my life. I took my assigned seat at the head table, squeezed between Connor and his overbearing mother, Constance. Catherine and Chloe sat directly across from us, their eyes gleaming with vicious anticipation. They didn't waste a single moment launching their coordinated attack. When the waiters began serving the first course of seared scallops and pouring vintage champagne, Catherine loudly expressed her deep, completely fabricated concern for my complexion. She deliberately raised her voice, so it carried clearly over the clinking of silver cutlery and soft jazz music, leaning toward Constance to drop a comment about how terribly worried she was that I might just pass out at the altar. She sighed heavily, stating I looked dreadfully pale and sickly, implying I was entirely unfit for such a demanding public event. Chloe eagerly grabbed the baton, leaning over her porcelain plate with a venomous smirk thinly veiled as sisterly sympathy. She loudly pointed out the dark circles under my eyes. Circles I had deliberately emphasized with a gray makeup pencil before leaving the house, just to maintain the illusion of my rapid health decline. She asked Connor's father, a stoic man who clearly despised public displays of weakness, if he had a doctor on standby waiting in the sacristy. She giggled lightly, suggesting that dragging a frail ghost down the aisle might ruin the aesthetic of the professional wedding photos. They mercilessly played the elite audience, joining forces to paint me as a broken, pathetic burden who should be pitied and hidden away, rather than respected. Connor played his part in this charade flawlessly. He wrapped his arm around my waist, pulled me close, and adopted an expression of tragic, unwavering devotion. He kissed my temple, holding his breath exactly as he confessed on the recording safely tucked away on my phone, and assured his wealthy parents that if I lost my strength, he would personally carry me down the aisle in his arms. It was a nauseating, Oscar-worthy performance that made my skin crawl beneath the white silk, but I maintained my passive, serene expression, letting the parasites revel in their supposed superiority. The main course of dry-aged steaks arrived, and expensive wine flowed freely. Chloe, having already downed 3 large glasses of heavy Cabernet, decided passive-aggressive verbal jabs were no longer enough to humiliate me. She wanted a physical spectacle. She wanted to break my composure in front of the people who mattered most to Connor's social standing. She stood up, holding her freshly poured, brim-filled glass of red wine, and began tapping her fork against the crystal rim to focus the entire room's attention on herself. She announced she wanted to propose a heartfelt toast to the happy couple. As silence fell over the mezzanine and all eyes turned toward our table, Chloe reached across the white linen tablecloth, ostensibly to clink her glass against mine. When her arm hovered over my plate, her hand miraculously slipped. With a violent, deliberate, and perfectly timed flick of her wrist, she sent the entire contents of deep crimson wine, cascading straight onto my chest. The dark liquid splashed forcefully against the pristine white silk of my gown, instantly blooming into a massive, undeniable, blood-red stain. The wine soaked through the delicate fabric in a fraction of a second, chilling my skin and dripping in heavy drops onto my lap. A dead silence fell over the entire upper mezzanine. A chorus of horrified gasps tore from the lips of Connor's extended family and wealthy in-laws. Chloe immediately covered her mouth with both hands, launching into an exaggerated, theatrical display of apologies. She started screaming about how incredibly clumsy she was, her voice pitching into a fake panic. Over and over, she begged for forgiveness, wiping the table with a napkin while her eyes met mine, gleaming with absolute malicious triumph. She had successfully made a public spectacle out of me. Catherine rushed around the table toward me, not to offer genuine help, but to dial up the performance. She grabbed a cloth napkin and began roughly dabbing at the ruined silk on my chest, loudly clicking her tongue in feigned despair. She turned to Constance and began apologizing profusely on my behalf, lamenting how difficult it was for me to handle public outings in my current fragile state. She treated me like a clumsy toddler who had just soiled herself in public. Their intent was crystal clear. They wanted to reduce me to a weeping, humiliated victim who couldn't even survive a sit-down dinner without causing a catastrophic, embarrassing scene. The old Maggie would have fled the room in tears, hiding in the restroom while the stain ate into the fabric and whispers circled among the elite guests. But I didn't cry, I didn't flinch, and I didn't run. I sat perfectly still, ignoring the cold wine soaking into my skin, and looked straight into my sister's triumphant eyes. I smiled. It was a small, terrifyingly calm smile that made Chloe's theatrical, fake sobbing falter for a split second. Gently but firmly, I pushed my mother's hands away from my chest. I calmly stood up, smoothing the ruined, wine-soaked silk of my skirt, entirely ignoring the giant stain that marked me like a bullseye. I turned to the dead silent room, modulating my voice with a firm, unwavering authority that made Connor's parents blink in surprise. I assured my horrified future in-laws that it was just a piece of fabric, a minor spill that meant absolutely nothing. I raised my water glass, looking dead at Connor, Chloe, and Catherine, and stated clearly that nothing in this world could ruin the absolute perfection of what was to come tomorrow. The moment I lowered the glass and sat down, I deliberately let my mask of fierce resistance crack. That toast was a brilliant shock to their systems, but I couldn't keep up the Iron Lady routine if I wanted to properly execute the next phase of my retaliation. I needed Connor to feel superior, comfortable, and completely in control of the situation. So as the silence on the mezzanine dragged into an uncomfortable eternity, I forced my shoulders to drop. I quickened my breathing, letting my chest rise unevenly, staring down at the massive, dripping red stain ruining my silk dress. I raised trembling hands to cover my face, allowing genuine-looking tears to stream down my cheeks. I apologized profusely to Constance and Catherine, my voice breaking as I claimed my strong anti-nausea meds were making me irrationally emotional and completely off balance. Catherine and Chloe exchanged a quick, triumphant glance across the white tablecloth. They successfully broke my fragile spirit. They manufactured exactly the breakdown they wanted, reducing me to a weeping, humiliated wreck in front of New York high society. I turned blindly to Connor, grabbing his forearm in a desperate, pathetic grip. I begged him to take me somewhere quiet so I could clean myself up and catch my breath. Recognizing the perfect opportunity to play the devoted, protective groom for his wealthy parents and the still circling society photographers, he immediately leaped into action. He excused us from the table with a grave, concerned nod, wrapping his suit jacket around my ruined shoulders to shield me from judgmental stares. He escorted me away from the clinking crystal and soft jazz music, guiding me down a carpeted hallway to a secluded, dimly lit wine-tasting room adjacent to the main dining hall. The moment the heavy mahogany door clicked shut, cutting us off from the hum of the restaurant, his entire demeanor shifted. The tragic, supportive fiancé vanished. Connor pulled away from me, crossing his arms over his chest with a heavy sigh of deep annoyance. There was no longer an audience to perform for, so he didn't even bother handing me a napkin. He just stared at the ceiling, waiting for my alleged panic attack to pass so we could get back to his networking event. I leaned against a tall rack of vintage bottles, uselessly wiping at the red wine on my chest, my breathing still ragged. I looked at him with wide, absolutely terrified eyes. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. I told him my medical billing lawyers ambushed me that very afternoon. I spun a frantic, incredibly convincing story about my mounting oncology debts, claiming the research hospital was threatening to slap aggressive liens on my future spouse's assets. The split second we legally wed, I told him, the bills for the experimental immunotherapy would be astronomical, and debt collectors would ruthlessly target any joint accounts we might open. I cried, stating I couldn't bear the thought of my illness dragging down his pristine hedge fund, ruining his perfect credit score, or staining his family's generational wealth. With trembling hands, I extended the thick stack of papers toward him. I presented it as a hastily drafted emergency prenuptial agreement, written solely to act as a titanium firewall between his millions and my inevitable medical bankruptcy. I practically begged him to sign it right then and there, painting myself as a guilty, desperate burden who simply wanted to protect the amazing man she loved before it was too late. Connor's eyes lit up with a greedy, ravenous hunger. For a man who was secretly drowning in toxic debt, teetering on the edge of a catastrophic financial crash and potential SEC indictments, the concept of a legal shield was an irresistible godsend. He believed his fund was failing, but he still thought he could salvage his own assets and steal my life insurance. The idea that my fake medical debt could somehow attach to him was a terrifying prospect. This document represented the ultimate protection. He didn't know that Marcus, operating with absolute surgical precision, had redacted every single syllable of this contract. It was a masterpiece of legal deception, designed to look exactly like standard asset protection on the first 3 pages. But buried deep within the dense, convoluted paragraphs of the liability clauses was a mutually binding, catastrophic trigger. The hidden provision explicitly dictated that in the event either party called off the wedding at the altar or was found guilty of committing any form of financial fraud, that party immediately forfeits and relinquishes all personal and corporate assets. Furthermore, the guilty party would simultaneously assume the entirety of the other party's outstanding debts. Connor was so blinded by his own towering arrogance and so completely convinced of my naive stupidity that he didn't even bother reading anything past page 1. He saw the bold heading shielding his assets from medical claims, and his ego did the rest. He assumed a dying, panicked woman was simply handing him a blank check for immunity. He pulled a slim silver pen from his jacket pocket. He uncapped it with a quick, eager motion and pressed it to the paper. He didn't hesitate for a second. He didn't ask to run it by his own lawyers. He simply signed on the dotted line, sealing his own doom with an ornate flourish of dark blue ink. He flipped to the last page and initialed the addendums without a second glance. The scratch of his pen against the thick paper was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. He handed the signed document back to me, adopting a tone of magnanimous pity. He told me to stop troubling my sick little head with finances, assuring me he would take care of absolutely everything. I slipped the contract back into my clutch, and the digital lock on his financial coffin snapped shut with a hiss. I wiped my tears, thanked him for his endless generosity, and walked back out into the dining room carrying the weapon that would destroy him entirely. The memory of his pen scratching against the thick paper of the liability agreement dissolved, brutally ripped away by the echoing, horrified murmurs bouncing off the vaulted stone ceilings of the cathedral. We snapped back to the present, standing at the ornate marble altar bathed in the kaleidoscopic light of the stained glass. The heavy, suffocating illusion I had maintained for so many months finally lay in a crumpled, synthetic pile on the floor. I stood before the congregation completely unmasked, the cool, air-conditioned air of the sanctuary washing over my bare scalp. Connor stood barely 2 steps away from me, his perfectly styled hair gleaming under the altar lights. He had just delivered his rehearsed, devastating line, his voice breaking with a perfectly timed dose of theatrical suffering as he declared he could not marry a ghost and could not tie his life to a fading specter. He played the role of the tragically overwhelmed groom to absolute perfection, seeking pity from this elite crowd. From the front pew, my mother Catherine immediately launched her own venomous attack. Her face was flushed with aristocratic fury, and the pearls at her neck trembled against her collarbones as she hissed in disgust. She loudly reprimanded me, her voice piercing through the shocked whispers of the guests, as she demanded to know why I had to humiliate the family on such a massive scale. She spat that my display was grotesque, a pathetic cry for attention, and that a man of Connor's standing deserved to see exactly who he was dealing with before signing his life away. The assembled New York socialites, hedge fund managers, and matrons with generational wealth flinched uncomfortably in their polished oak pews. They whispered behind manicured hands, clutching their silk ceremony programs, and staring at my bald head as if it were some grotesque crime against their flawless aesthetics. Chloe sat next to our mother, wearing a mask of deep sisterly tragedy, though I could easily spot the vicious, triumphant glint dancing in her eyes. She thought the game was over. She thought Connor was successfully executing their exit strategy, paving the way for the life insurance payout and their escape abroad. I didn't break down. I didn't erupt into the frantic, hyperventilating tears they all so desperately expected from the fragile, dying bride. Instead, I took a deep, calming breath, pulling the scent of the massive white floral arrangements deep into my lungs. I slowly raised my hand to my head, my fingertips brushing the smooth, bare skin. I rubbed it with absolute, uncompromising pride. It was not a symbol of my impending death. It was the ultimate proof of my indestructible survival. It was armor forged in the fire of their relentless betrayal. I let my hand drop to my side, straightening up so much that I towered over them in my custom-tailored white gown. I ignored Connor's sudden, confused gaze and purposely walked around him. I passed the shocked priest, who was clutching his missal to his chest like a shield, and approached the brass microphone stand positioned at the edge of the altar steps. I gripped the cool metal of the microphone. The speakers positioned throughout the enormous cathedral let out a sharp, high-pitched feedback squeal that instantly cut through the murmurs and plunged the sanctuary into absolute, breathless silence. Absolutely every single eye in the building was fixed straight on me. "My mother is absolutely right," I said, my voice echoing off the stone pillars. Steady, booming, and completely devoid of fear. I looked straight down at Catherine, whose mouth had slightly parted in shock at my absolute composure. "She just said I am making a spectacle of myself. She said a man of Connor's flawless social standing deserves better than being ambushed. She said he deserves to see exactly who he is dealing with today." I paused, letting those heavy words wash over the crowd, watching Connor's parents stiffen in the second row. For the first time in my entire life, I completely agree with her. I slowly dragged my gaze away from my mother, letting my eyes sweep across the hundreds of guests before stopping directly on Connor. His calculated mask of tragic grief was rapidly dissolving, giving way to creeping, animalistic panic. His jaw clenched, and he took a tiny, involuntary half-step backward. He recognized the tone of my voice. It was not the voice of the weak, submissive woman he thought he had manipulated for the past 6 months. It was the voice of a corporate predator that, deep down, he was terrified to fight. "We came here today to make a lifelong commitment," I continued, speaking clearly into the microphone, ensuring every syllable rang with crystalline sharpness. "We stood before all of you to pledge our honesty, our devotion, and our absolute transparency. But this entire cathedral is currently suffocating under a mountain of carefully constructed lies. You look at me and see a tragic, dying victim. You look at the man standing next to me and see a devoted, grieving hero. But illusions, no matter how beautifully dressed or expensively funded, cannot survive the light of day." I looked down at Chloe. Her smugness had completely evaporated, replaced by a stiff, wide-eyed stare of terror. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden pew until her knuckles turned white. She knew something catastrophically bad was happening, but she was completely powerless to stop it. "Connor absolutely deserves to know who he is dealing with," I announced to the silent, captivated crowd. "But more importantly, every single person sitting in these pews, every investor, every family member, and every supposed friend deserves to see exactly who is standing at this altar. You deserve to see the reality hidden behind the designer suits and tragic tears." I stepped back from the microphone, my heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. I tilted my head back and looked high above the shocked congregation, past the massive gilded pipes of the giant church organ, aiming my gaze straight at the shadowed audiovisual balcony near the vaulted ceiling. Marcus's trusted tech operator was stationed right there, hidden from view, his hands hovering over the main control console. I raised my right hand, catching the operator's attention, and gave one sharp nod. The signal was given. Instantly, the lighting in the cathedral dimmed, casting harsh, distinct shadows across the altar. Two massive digital projection screens, originally installed on either side of the chancel to display hymns and a tasteful, pre-approved romantic photo montage Connor insisted on, suddenly roared to life with a blinding white glare. The heavy, thumping hum of the cathedral's state-of-the-art sound system kicked in, vibrating through the marble floors and penetrating straight through the soles of my shoes. The trap I had so meticulously constructed was finally snapping shut. The blinding white light on both projection screens sharpened, transitioning into a crisp, undeniably clear, high-definition color image. The massive speakers, calibrated to perfection for a soaring choir, stopped humming and blasted crystal-clear audio straight into the giant nave of the church. The image of my own living room materialized above the altar, magnified to colossal proportions. Every single guest in the cathedral was forced to look at the undeniable sight of Connor and Chloe, intimately entangled on my couch, their 10-foot-tall faces broadcast for the entire congregation to see. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, sucked all the oxygen straight out of the enormous sanctuary. I watched the blood drain from Connor's face, leaving him a sickly ashen hue. He froze with his jaw hanging open, his eyes darting frantically between the two screens as his own recorded voice began echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. The acoustics of the cathedral were flawless, amplifying his furious, desperate greed, so much that absolutely not a single syllable could be ignored, rationalized, or misinterpreted. His voice boomed through the speakers, confessing to the catastrophic reality of his highly acclaimed boutique hedge fund. The assembled guests, largely comprised of his wealthy, demanding investors and elite society peers, listened in paralyzed horror as Connor openly admitted to the total, irreversible collapse of his firm. They heard him confess to disastrous, highly leveraged bets on volatile tech startups. They heard his panicked admission that he was mere days away from total financial ruin and potential federal indictments from the DOJ for white-collar crimes and criminal negligence in managing their closely guarded capital. The elite crowd began to murmur, forming a low, buzzing hive of outrage and shock as the flawless illusion of Connor's professional genius shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces right before their eyes. But the professional disgrace was merely a prelude to the ultimate, nauseating revelation. The video continued its relentless mechanical march forward. The entire church watched as a giant, high-definition version of Connor rested his forehead against my sister's shoulder. They heard the sickening punchline delivered with blood-curdling, casual clarity. They heard him promise Chloe he was going through with this grand cathedral wedding solely to secure ironclad legal status as my primary heir. The words detailing a $12 million life insurance policy echoed with a deafening boom in the sacred space, ricocheting off the stained glass and hitting the congregation with the force of a physical blow. The horror escalated instantly as Connor callously calculated the timeline of my illness out loud for everyone to hear. He stated bluntly, without a shadow of hesitation or remorse, that my aggressive cancer would surely finish me off within 6 months of the ceremony. The final, devastating blow landed when he detailed his meticulously crafted exit strategy. Immediate liquidation of his failing firm, the split second the massive insurance payout hit the account, taking the pure cash and fleeing with my sister to some luxurious offshore tax haven. Absolute unbridled pandemonium erupted inside the cathedral walls. The stunned silence shattered into a chaotic symphony of outrage, disgust, and appalled shouts. Constance, Connor's mother, let out a choked, breathless gasp. Her manicured hands flew to her throat, her face turning the color of chalk. His father, a man whose entire existence relied on stoic superiority and unblemished social standing, gripped the edge of the wooden pew so tightly his knuckles turned white. He locked his jaw with such force it looked as if his teeth were about to crumble under the pressure. They were watching their golden boy publicly confess to a gruesome, predatory conspiracy, dragging their esteemed family name through the absolute deepest layers of mud. Members of elite society around them physically recoiled in disgust. Whispers escalated into loud, hostile declarations of revulsion aimed directly at the front row. Catherine sat paralyzed, her eyes darted frantically between the giant screens and her precious golden daughter. Chloe looked like she had been struck by lightning. She was trapped in the church pew, her face a mask of stiff, wide-eyed terror as her own voice betrayed her on the recording, eagerly agreeing to this sick, parasitic fantasy. She had nowhere to run, no clever lie she could spin, and no fake tears she could produce to escape this massive, undeniable truth projected above her head. The people who once worshipped her beauty and charm now stared at her with unconcealed loathing. Connor finally snapped. The pure, animalistic panic of a cornered predator completely consumed his calculated, polished facade. In a fraction of a second, he realized his carefully crafted public image, his desperately needed financial salvation, and his freedom were disintegrating in real time in front of his most important investors. His face contorted into a mask of pure, untainted fury. He let out a wild, guttural scream that tore his throat, a sound completely devoid of humanity and filled only with panicked rage. He lunged forward, his expensive tuxedo jacket straining across his shoulders as he threw his entire body weight toward the pulpit. His eyes were wide and crazed, his hands outstretched like claws, desperately aiming to rip the microphone from my grip or destroy the AV equipment to stop the broadcast. He wanted to silence me. He wanted to destroy the source of his exposure with his bare hands and drag me down with him into the ruins of his own life. He never even made it past the first marble step. Two massive men in unmarked, tailored suits moved with the sudden, terrifying speed of striking vipers. I had hired them weeks ago, explicitly instructing them to blend invisibly into the front row of the congregation, anticipating exactly this kind of violent desperation. They intercepted Connor with brutal, flawless efficiency. One of the bodyguards drove a heavy shoulder straight into Connor's chest, completely stopping his momentum with a sickeningly hollow thud, while the second grabbed his outstretched arm, forcefully twisting it behind his back in a swift, practiced motion. Connor crashed heavily onto the cold marble floor in front of the altar. His polished dress shoes slipped uselessly, searching for traction on the smooth stone. The guards pinned him to the ground in a flash. One of them drove a knee hard between his shoulder blades, neutralizing his furious, thrashing resistance. Within seconds, he was flailing wildly, screaming muffled, furious curses straight into the marble, his face pressed against the floor exactly where we were supposed to say our vows. But the guards held him with absolute, immovable force. I stood perfectly still at the microphone, standing tall with a serene expression, looking down at the writhing, defeated wreck of a man pinned at my feet, while his own recorded voice delivered the final, damning sentence from the video projected above our heads. Connor's recorded voice faded into the cavernous heights of the cathedral, replaced only by his heavy, ragged breathing as he fought fruitlessly against the polished marble floor. The two bodyguards held him in an iron grip, their faces expressing absolutely nothing, while the giant digital screens above us finally went black, plunging the altar back into the warm, kaleidoscopic glow of the stained glass. The assembled guests remained frozen in a state of collective paralysis, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had just witnessed. I held the brass microphone in my hand, but my role in this specific act had come to an end. I turned my head slightly, scanning the third row of oak pews and locating the only man who possessed the power to deal the final, fatal blow to my mother and sister. Marcus slowly rose from his seat. He did not rush, nor did he shrink under the sudden weight of 1,000 eyes focused on him. He wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying professionalism. He stepped into the main aisle, the sharp click of his leather dress shoes echoing loudly against the stone floor. As he walked toward the altar, the sea of wealthy socialites, corporate titans, and hedge fund directors instinctively parted, leaning back in their wooden pews as if making way for an executioner. He ascended the marble steps with calculated precision, completely ignoring the thrashing groom pinned to the floor at my feet, and stood right by my side. I stepped back, handing him the microphone stand. Marcus adjusted the mic with one swift motion. He looked out over the sea of pale, scandalized faces, sweeping the room with a dark gaze of cold authority, before locking eyes dead on the front pew where my mother and sister were trembling. He introduced himself to the congregation, his voice deep, firm, and carrying the undeniable weight of legal consequences. He stated his full name and presented his credentials, explaining to the silenced cathedral that he was an independent forensic auditor, a specialist hired specifically by me to untangle complex webs of financial fraud. The word investigator sent a visible shudder through the elite crowd. They knew exactly what that title meant. It meant paper trails. It meant scrutiny from federal authorities. It meant absolute ruin. Marcus reached into the inner breast pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out a thick, tightly clipped stack of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and audit reports. He held the massive stack of papers high in the air, a physical manifestation of incoming destruction. He declared that while Connor's predatory greed was a hideous moral failure, at its core it was merely the desperate flailing of a failing businessman. However, Marcus continued, his voice dropping an octave, echoing ominously through the speakers, the crimes committed by the bride's own family were far more insidious, crossing the thin line between moral bankruptcy and deliberate, premeditated federal felonies. Catherine gripped the edge of the pew so tightly her knuckles turned white, her perfect aristocratic posture shrinking into a defensive crouch. Chloe looked as if she were about to physically throw up, her eyes darting wildly toward the heavy wooden exit doors at the back of the sanctuary. Marcus didn't give them a second to formulate an escape plan. He opened the heavy file and began to read. He didn't use vague accusations or emotional hyperbole. He spoke in the cold, ruthless language of mathematics, bank ledgers, and federal indictments. Methodically and loudly, he dissected the entire paper trail. Page by page, he read aloud exact transaction dates, tracing the flow of illicit capital with surgical precision. He named the foundation, a highly respected state-subsidized charity dedicated to funding experimental therapies for pediatric oncology patients. A collective gasp of pure revulsion swept through the pews. Theft was one thing in these circles, but stealing from sick, dying children was an unforgivable, socially damning atrocity. An atrocity made all the more sickening by the fact that they simultaneously used my oncology diagnosis to garner sympathy. Marcus raised his voice to ensure the people in the back rows heard absolutely every digit. He read the specific routing numbers of the shell accounts Catherine had set up in Chloe's name, citing an offshore account ending in 4,892. He detailed exactly how they abused Catherine's trusted position on the charity's local advisory board. He explained that my mother created fake invoices from non-existent suppliers and phantom grant payouts, quietly authorizing wire transfers to slowly bleed the foundation dry. He stated the exact, undeniable amount they siphoned from the Pediatric Oncology Fund over the last 14 months. It was a staggering sum of $600,000. Marcus didn't stop there. He explained exactly where that stolen money went, tracking the laundered funds straight to their selfish vanity. He listed the luxury boutiques, exclusive spas, and expensive resorts where Chloe and Catherine liquidated the stolen assets. He detailed nearly $90,000 spent at a high-end jeweler and nearly $60,000 wired to rent a private ski lodge in Aspen, proving how they turned life-saving charity money into designer handbags and first-class plane tickets. He held up bank statements bearing Chloe's digital signature and Catherine's authorization stamps, waving this undeniable proof in front of the congregation. He stated firmly that a complete, uncensored copy of these files had already been handed directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, as well as the Internal Revenue Service, exactly 1 hour before the ceremony began. The cathedral erupted in noise again, but this time it wasn't just shock. It was pure, untainted outrage. Constance, who built her entire social standing on hosting prestigious charity galas, looked at Catherine with an expression of absolute venomous disgust. The elite crowd began openly jeering and shouting. Wealthy donors who likely contributed to this specific foundation themselves, realizing they were sitting shoulder to shoulder with common thieves. Catherine desperately tried to stand up, opening her mouth to scream a denial, but no words came out. She was hyperventilating. Her perfectly styled hair fell into a panicked, sweaty mess across her face. While the New York social elite turned their backs on her in real time, Chloe was now weeping openly. These weren't the fake, theatrical tears from last night's dinner, but the ugly, choking sobs of a woman who just realized she was going to federal prison. The destruction of their carefully crafted lives was absolute, playing out exactly as I had planned. The crushing impact of Marcus's words hung in the suffocating cathedral air, but he wasn't done dismantling the illusion. I looked away slightly as he pointed one commanding finger toward the vaulted ceiling. High above the altar, the giant digital projection screens changed images with a blinding flash. The humiliating, larger-than-life video of Connor confessing his financial ruin vanished, instantly replaced by a stark, split-screen presentation of undeniable guilt. On the left side of the glowing displays, floating 10 feet in the air against the backdrop of historic stone pillars, were crisp, high-definition scans of the forged foundation withdrawal slips. The crowd could easily read the name of the pediatric oncology charity right above my mother's unmistakable, looping authorization signature. On the right side of the screens, perfectly aligned for a brutal comparison, were blindingly clear invoices from an exclusive luxury car dealership in the most expensive part of town. The dates of the massive bank withdrawals matched the dates on the dealership invoices perfectly. The totals mirrored each other down to the last sickening penny. The congregation stared in paralyzed horror as Chloe's name appeared printed in bold black letters on the registration for a brand new, custom-ordered Porsche. This visual juxtaposition was methodical, mathematical, and absolutely irrefutable. The gasps from the pews grew louder, morphing into a low, powerful roar of hostile murmurs. The wealthy socialites, hedge fund directors, and matrons of generational wealth who populated the front rows physically recoiled in disgust. These were their equals in status, regulars at the same charity galas, who had just seen exactly how the lavish, enviable lifestyles my mother and sister flaunted were directly funded by stealing resources meant for dying kids. The sheer, brazen audacity of this crime, broadcast in high definition in this sacred space, was too massive for anyone to comprehend. The crushing weight of public exposure finally snapped the fragile thread holding the last remnants of Catherine's sanity together. She scrambled out of the polished wooden pew, her expensive heels clicking chaotically and violently against the stone floor. She lunged toward the altar, her face contorted into a mask of pure, deranged desperation. Her aristocratic posture lay in ruins. She let out a piercing, guttural shriek, a sound so raw and frantic it echoed monstrously through the cavernous nave, ordering Marcus to shut his mouth immediately. She flailed her arms wildly, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking together in a chaotic, frantic rhythm as she desperately tried to salvage her ruined reputation. She screamed at the horrified congregation that the documents were fabricated, that this entire presentation was a malicious, elaborate setup. She aimed a trembling, accusing finger straight at Marcus. Her voice cracked as she shrieked that he was a traitor, a pathological liar, and a deeply bitter fraud trying to destroy a prominent family that had so graciously taken him under their roof. She desperately tried to spin a frantic narrative about a disgruntled son-in-law seeking revenge. Her voice grew increasingly shrill and panicked, while the wealthy onlookers simply stared at her with hardened, unforgiving eyes. Nobody bought this frantic performance. The evidence glowing brightly above her head was too overwhelming, too absolute, and too perfectly documented. Marcus didn't even flinch. He stood as still and immovable as a marble statue, letting the frantic waves of my mother's hysteria crash uselessly against his iron composure. He did not raise his voice to match her frantic screaming, nor did he try to argue with her deranged denials. He simply looked down at her with an expression of deep, blood-curdling emptiness, maintaining the absolute calm of a predator watching a trapped insect thrash about. He waited patiently for her to run out of breath, allowing the deafening acoustics of the cathedral to amplify her pathetic, frantic desperation so everyone could hear it. When her screams finally devolved into heavy, panicked panting, the silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Catherine stood frozen at the base of the altar steps, her chest heaving slowly. She had just realized her social reign in New York was over, irreversibly and catastrophically. Marcus slowly dragged his gaze away from my ruined mother and looked directly at Chloe. With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus reached into the tailored breast pocket of his charcoal jacket for the second time. The entire sanctuary held its breath. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like a physical weight. He pulled out a second folder, much thinner than the massive financial dossier, bound in a stark, matte black cover. He stepped down from the raised marble platform, closing the distance between the altar and the front row with slow, predatory steps. Chloe stared at the black folder like it was a loaded gun, her eyes wide with creeping primal terror. Marcus stopped exactly 2 feet from her trembling knees. Without a single word of introduction or hesitation, he flicked his wrist and tossed the folder right at her feet. It landed on the historic stone floor with a sharp, resonating slap that echoed through the deathly silent church like a gunshot. Marcus looked down at his wife, his dark eyes completely devoid of warmth, pity, or shared history. His voice, perfectly amplified by the lapel mic he was still wearing, rang out with icy finality. He announced to the breathless crowd that the folder contained fully drafted, expedited divorce papers. He stated with a tone of absolute, unyielding determination that he refused to spend a single second longer being legally, financially, or morally bound to a parasite. The words hit Chloe like a physical blow, knocking her head back against the wooden pew. He stated loudly that he was severing all ties immediately, ensuring that when the federal authorities inevitably came for her to drag her out of her stolen luxury life, his clean name and spotless professional record would not be anchored to her sinking ship. Having delivered the fatal blow, he turned his back on her in a gesture of absolute, permanent rejection and slowly walked back up the altar, steps to stand right by my side. The sheer finality of Marcus's cold rejection shattered the last, tiniest fragment of Chloe's composure. The reality of her catastrophic situation crashed down on her with the crushing force of a tidal wave. She lost her handsome, wealthy backup plan, her stolen charity wealth, her pristine social standing, and her freedom, all within 15 agonizing minutes. A guttural, tearing sob ripped from her throat, a sound completely devoid of her practiced, artificial grace. Her legs completely gave out. She collapsed from the pew, sliding onto the cold marble floor, next to the black folder. She curled into a tight, pathetic ball, her expensive silk dress wrapping around her like discarded trash. As she raised her hands to cover her face, she began crying hysterically, her shoulders heaving to the rhythm of violent, choking sobs that echoed pathetically through the cathedral. There were no cameras left to perform for, no wealthy donors to manipulate, and no affluent groom waiting to save her. All that remained was the cold, hard floor, the blinding light of her own financial crimes projected high above her, and the absolute certainty of her impending doom. The piercing, pitiful sound of Chloe's uncontrollable sobbing bounced off the vaulted ceilings, serving as a pathetic soundtrack to her total annihilation. Marcus stood beside me on the raised marble platform like an immovable pillar of righteous fury, his dark eyes surveying the absolute wreckage we had just created. Below, the once flawless sanctuary choked under a heavy, paralyzed silence. The elite congregation sat completely immobilized, their collective gaze shifting from the weeping woman huddled on the floor to the furious, thrashing groom pinned to the cold stone. Connor breathed heavily, his chest heaving against the unyielding weight of the 2 massive bodyguards pressing him into the polished marble. His expensive silk tie was skewed, and his perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket had ridden up to his shoulders in a crumpled mess. The sheer physical humiliation of being subdued like a common criminal in front of the most powerful investors on Wall Street was visibly tearing him apart from the inside. But his towering, blinding arrogance simply couldn't process the finality of his defeat. He refused to accept that the naive, easily manipulated woman he intended to discard had so thoroughly dismantled his entire existence. With a violent, jerky motion, Connor twisted his head to the side, scraping his cheek across the stone floor just to lock his crazed, furious gaze directly into my eyes. The mask of the tragic, heartbroken fiancé was gone forever, replaced by the vile, cornered animal hiding underneath. He stopped fighting the arm, pinning his shoulders, and instead channeled every ounce of his remaining energy into a desperate, malicious attempt to salvage his bruised ego. He bared his teeth, and his voice strained into a harsh, ragged scream that echoed sharply through the cavernous nave. He screamed that I was a psychotic, unhinged monster. He roared to the shocked crowd that he would never tie his life to a deranged, vindictive lunatic. He craned his neck, glaring at the pulpit with a look of pure, untainted hatred, and announced at the top of his lungs that he was officially calling off the engagement right here and now. He let out a sharp, breathless laugh, a sound bordering on absolute insanity, trying to spin his humiliation into a victory. He yelled that this elaborate, pathetic, theatrical trick meant absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. He cruelly bragged that no matter what was displayed on those giant screens, I was still just a fading, dying ghost with an expiration date. He spat the words like venom, claiming I would die penniless, rotting in some sterile hospital bed all alone, while he would bounce back from this minor hiccup, restructure his firm, and leave my memory in the dust. He truly believed that by publicly rejecting me, by abandoning me before the priest could finish the ceremony, he had the last word and reclaimed his power. I stood behind the brass microphone stand, looking down at his furious red face. I didn't flinch at his cruel insults. I didn't shed a single tear over his vile predictions about my death. Instead, a slow, genuine smile bloomed on my face. It wasn't a smile of relief, but one of cold, calculated triumph. His public rejection was the exact, precise trigger I had been waiting for. It was the final, fatal mistake in a long sequence of arrogant blunders. "Thank you, Connor," I said smoothly into the microphone, my voice composed, amplified, and ringing with absolute authority. "Thank you for saying that so loudly, and thank you for making that specific declaration in front of hundreds of witnesses." His maniacal laughter caught in his throat. His eyes narrowed in sudden, creeping confusion. I reached down to a hidden wooden shelf built into the back of the pulpit. My fingers found the familiar, heavy texture of the thick paper I had placed there that very morning. I pulled out the legally binding document, holding the thick stack of papers high in the air for the entire congregation to see. The warm light streaming through the stained glass fell on the stark white pages and the dark blue ink of his hasty signature on the final sheet. "Remember the private wine tasting room, Connor?" I asked, my voice echoing through the silent cathedral. "Remember that emergency prenuptial agreement I handed you? The same one you signed without reading a single word, because you were so incredibly eager to protect your precious hedge fund from my impending medical bankruptcy?" Connor stopped breathing. The color that had rushed into his face in anger instantly drained away, leaving him a sickening, translucent shade of white. He stared at the document in my hand, his chest freezing against the marble floor. "You thought you were signing a titanium firewall to protect your assets?" I continued, relishing the absolute terror beginning to dawn in his wide eyes. "But you were so blinded by your own towering ego that you didn't even bother to review the liability clause on page 4. Marcus isn't just a forensic auditor. He's a master of legal structuring, and he redacted every single syllable of this contract with surgical precision." I opened the heavy document, flipping the pages directly to page 4. I smoothed the crease and leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring not a single syllable escaped the hypnotized crowd. "Let me read you this hidden provision that you so eagerly initialed," I announced, my tone shifting into the stiff, clinical cadence of a corporate lawyer. "Section 4, Paragraph 7. In the event that either party officially calls off the wedding at the altar or is found guilty of committing any form of financial fraud, that party immediately and irrevocably forfeits and relinquishes all personal and corporate assets to the aggrieved party." A sharp, collective gasp rolled through the front rows. Connor's father let out a choked, breathless sound, realizing the lethal, binding nature of the legal trap his son had so blindly walked into. My gaze was locked directly onto Connor's terrified face as I read the final, devastating sentence. Furthermore, the forfeiting party simultaneously assumes the entirety of the aggrieved party's outstanding debts, liabilities, and financial obligations, effective immediately upon the verbal cancellation of the nuptials. I lowered the document, resting it against the polished wood of the pulpit. The silence in the cathedral was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. "By officially breaking off our engagement right here at the altar, in front of all these witnesses, you legally activated this trap," I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "You no longer own your failing hedge fund, Connor. You do not own your luxury penthouse. You do not own your offshore accounts or sports cars. As of this exact second, I own absolutely everything that bears your name." Connor let out a raw, pathetic sound, a hollow, breathless rattle of a man whose soul had just been ripped straight out of his chest. He slumped completely flat against the cold stone, all will to fight instantly, leaving his body. With absolute, crushing certainty, he realized his arrogant bragging was the very mechanism of his own destruction. Not only had he lost the $12 million life insurance payout, but he had personally handed me the keys to his entire existence, taking on my fabricated medical debts while simultaneously giving me every last penny he owned. He was financially ruined, legally bound, and completely trapped in a cage he built himself. The silence in the cathedral was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. Connor lay pinned to the cold marble, his eyes wide and vacant, as his brain desperately tried to process the deadly math of the prenup. He believed he finally understood the depths of the trap. He believed his ultimate punishment was the cruel irony of taking on my fabricated astronomical medical debts while handing over whatever meager hidden liquid assets he managed to squirrel away from his failing firm. He thought that was rock bottom. He was spectacularly wrong. I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden pulpit, the train of my pristine white gown gliding smoothly over the historic stone steps. I walked down to the edge of the platform, looking down at the man who had spent the last year eagerly awaiting my death. I held the brass microphone effortlessly, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate level that somehow carried with crystalline clarity all the way to the back rows of the terrified congregation. I addressed Connor directly with a completely conversational tone, asking him if he really thought I spent the last 12 months lying weakly in a sterile hospital bed, passively waiting for an imaginary tumor to take my life. I watched him frown, a spark of raw, desperate confusion breaking through his absolute terror. I informed him that my frequent, long absences, those days and weeks he so gleefully assumed were spent in grueling chemotherapy or recovering from exhausting radiation, were indeed spent in a brightly lit, sterile environment. But it wasn't the oncology ward. It was a high-security server room at a tech incubator downtown. I announced to the deathly quiet cathedral that I was never sick. I was just busy. I explained that the complex diagnostic algorithm I had been working on for the past 3 years, the same project he so routinely and arrogantly mocked as a cute little hobby meant to distract my mind from impending doom, had finally been perfected. I let the words hang in the air for a split second, then dropped the first devastating payload. I stated, clearly articulating every single syllable, that exactly a month ago, a massive Silicon Valley healthcare conglomerate purchased my proprietary medical algorithm in a closed, expedited acquisition. The final sale price was an uncensored, immediate cash transfer of $140 million. The collective gasp that rolled through the sanctuary was deafening. The wealthy elites sitting in the pews, people who measured human worth solely in equity and profit margins, stared at me as if I had just materialized out of thin air. I was not a tragic dying charity case looking for a few last months of comfort. In this exact moment, I was vastly wealthier than almost every single person sitting in that room. Connor's jaw completely dropped. The bodyguard was still pressing his shoulders firmly to the floor, but Connor had entirely stopped fighting him. He stared up at me, his chest barely moving, his eyes darting frantically side to side as he tried to comprehend the staggering scale of his miscalculation. He spent months enduring a relationship with a woman he despised, counting down the days until he could snatch a measly $12 million in life insurance, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sleeping next to a woman worth more than 10 times that amount. The pure, blinding greed that fueled his every deceitful action had simultaneously blinded him to the actual gold mine sitting right under his nose. But that still wasn't the end. The true poetry of his destruction had not yet been fully revealed. I stepped down the final marble stair, stopping just inches from where Connor was pinned to the floor. I crouched gracefully, my heavy silk dress pooling around me like water, bringing my face perfectly level with his sweaty, panicked visage. I spoke softly into the microphone, making sure the entire congregation heard this final, fatal twist of the knife. I asked him if he remembered the name of that aggressive, anonymous venture capital fund that had systematically and ruthlessly bought up all the defaulting loans of his firm over the past 6 months. I watched the last remnants of blood completely drain from his face as I uttered the name of that shadowy corporate entity that haunted his nightmares. It was the phantom creditor that had ruthlessly cornered his firm, It was the monster that kept him up at night, the relentless debt collector he could neither track down, negotiate with, nor escape. I smiled, a slow, terrifying expression of absolute, unyielding victory. I informed him that this anonymous shell company was not managed by some syndicate of ruthless offshore investors. It was a limited liability company, registered in Delaware, entirely structured by Marcus, and 100% owned and operated by me. I used my initial 8-figure payout from the algorithm sale to quietly buy up every single ounce of his toxic, defaulting debt. I owned his failure. I owned the collapse of his firm. I was his phantom executioner. I stood back up, towering over his prone body, gripping the microphone tightly. Methodically, I broke down the legal reality of the prenuptial agreement he had just so foolishly activated. By screaming his rejection at the altar, he legally forfeited whatever meager hidden assets he still possessed, handing them directly to me. But far more importantly, by triggering the penalty clause, he legally assumed all of my outstanding liabilities. I explained to the terrified crowd that my only active liabilities were the operating margins of the shell company I used to buy out his toxic debt. He didn't take on my medical bills, because there simply were none. Instead, in his attempt to scam a dying woman, Connor inadvertently signed a legally binding document that stripped him of his corporate shield. He personally assumed all those millions of dollars in toxic debt generated by his own failing hedge fund. The massive debt he thought he was escaping by marrying me was now permanently shackled directly to his personal social security number. He owed millions, and he owed absolutely every single penny of it directly to me. A sound tore from Connor's lips that was barely human, a hollow, breathless rattle of a man falling into a dark, bottomless abyss. His eyes rolled slightly back into his head, his mind completely breaking under the weight of the mathematical impossibility he was trapped in. There was no legal loophole left, no clever maneuver, and no wealthy donor who could save him now. He was officially, entirely, and irreversibly bankrupt. He was permanently chained to a mountain of toxic debt he would never be able to repay. Stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his future. The absolute, crushing finality of his ruin settled over the cathedral, a masterpiece of destruction executed with flawless, ruthless precision. The crushing finality of Connor's ruin descended on the cathedral, leaving a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. I looked past the broken, hyperventilating man pinned to the marble and shifted my gaze to the base of the platform, where my mother stood completely frozen. For the past 20 minutes, Catherine had desperately clung to the delusion that there was a way out. She believed the vast wealth of Connor's hedge fund would somehow buy them out of the federal indictments, that his financial power would shield her from the consequences of robbing dying children. Now, that final, desperate safety net was leveled to the ground before her eyes. Not only was the money gone, but the very man she worshipped as their savior was completely and irreversibly bankrupt. He owed me millions. To her, he was now worse than useless. He had become a walking liability. I watched the exact moment her mind simply stopped functioning. The aristocratic mask, carefully cultivated through decades of exclusive country club lunches, charity galas, and ruthless social climbing, dissolved, giving way to a raw, grotesque portrait of feral rage. Her jaw dropped, and her eyes, usually so cold, composed, and calculated, darted wildly, flashing with the maniacal desperation of a cornered animal. The glittering social empire, on whose altar she sacrificed my entire childhood, was gone, replaced by the terrifying, undeniable certainty of a concrete prison cell. She had nothing left to lose, and in that moment of epiphany, she completely lost her mind. A guttural, animalistic shriek ripped from her throat, a sound so unnatural and violent it made the wealthy guests in the front row physically recoil in terror. She reached up and violently ripped the heavy diamond necklace from her throat as if it were choking her, throwing the precious stones blindly into the pews. She kicked off her custom-made designer heels, which hit the historic stone floor with a sharp clatter. Without the slightest word of warning, she lunged up the marble stairs. She didn't look like a grieving mother, a humiliated socialite, or the mother of the bride. She looked like a rabid beast out for blood. Her manicured hands curled into jagged claws, and her face contorted with a venomous, deranged desire to physically tear me to shreds. She screamed my name as a torrent of vile, incoherent curses spilled from her lips, charging directly at the pulpit. I didn't take a single step back. I didn't flinch, nor did I raise a hand to defend myself. I simply tightened my grip on the brass microphone stand and watched her approach, my face completely drained of emotion and my heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm. I knew I was completely safe. The two massive private bodyguards who had previously subdued Connor never dropped their guard for a second. They operated with the cold, mechanical efficiency of professionals who dealt with high-stakes, brutal violence on a daily basis. As Catherine cleared the final marble step, lunging for my throat with outstretched arms and bared teeth, the bodyguard on the left let go of Connor's shoulder and pivoted with blinding speed. He smoothly stepped into the line of Catherine's charge, lowering his center of gravity. He didn't punch her. He merely absorbed her frantic, reckless momentum. He wrapped a thick, muscular arm around her waist, twisting his hips to completely rob her of her balance. The momentum of her own deranged charge turned against her. The guard effortlessly redirected her flight path, lifting her slightly before bringing her straight down onto the unforgiving stone floor with a heavy, hollow thud. Catherine slammed forcefully into the marble, the air rushing from her lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. Before she could even attempt to scramble back to her feet or swing her clawed hands, the second bodyguard shifted his weight. He moved instantly to assist his partner, driving a heavy knee firmly between Catherine's shoulder blades and twisting both of her flailing wrists behind her back. In just 3 seconds, the maniacal attack was completely neutralized. Catherine now lay pinned flat on her stomach, her cheek pressed against the cold floor barely a few feet from where Connor was still immobilized. The visual poetry of this moment was profoundly poetic. The two main architects of my suffering, the greedy, manipulative groom and the narcissistic thieving mother, now lay immobilized side by side at the foot of the altar. Their expensive, tailored clothes were crumpled and ruined, their dignity entirely shattered, physically subdued, and pressed into the dirt by the very security forces I had hired myself to guard my operation. Catherine thrashed wildly under the pressure on her back, spitting and screaming as she was restrained. She demanded they let her go, shrieking that she knew the mayor, the police commissioner, and every powerful judge in New York. She howled that she would have the guards fired, sued, and ruined. The security personnel remained completely silent and unmoved, merely adjusting their grip to ensure she couldn't move an inch while she exhausted herself fighting their weight. The elite crowd watched with total, paralyzed horror. The wealthy donors, corporate titans, and high society matrons were witnessing the complete, undignified breakdown of a woman they had dined with just days prior. The illusion of her superiority was thoroughly dismantled, replaced by the pathetic reality of a cornered criminal throwing a violent tantrum on a church floor. And then, cutting cleanly through Catherine's frantic, echoing screams, a loud metallic grinding rang out from the very back of the sanctuary. The heavy iron bolt of the main entrance doors was being unlocked with immense, violent force. The massive, ancient oak doors of the cathedral burst wide open, slamming against the stone walls with a deafening boom that shook the very foundations of the building. The dim, warm, candle-like lighting of the church vestibule was instantly flooded by a harsh, strobe-light glare. Aggressive, chaotic flashes of red and blue emergency lights poured into the lobby, piercing the solemn shadows of the cathedral and painting the massive stone pillars in frantic alternating colors. The rhythmic, mechanical spin of the police sirens on the roofs of the cruisers cast long, distorted shadows down the main aisle, cutting straight through the sea of terrified wedding guests. Brilliant red and blue flashes illuminated the frightened faces of the congregation, blinking rapidly against the stained glass. The heavy, rhythmic thud of massive boots striking the stone floor echoed from the entrance. It was the raw, undeniable confirmation that the threat of federal legal sanctions had just become a physical reality. The authorities had arrived. A phalanx of men and women in dark windbreakers poured across the threshold of the cathedral, moving with a synchronized, tactical urgency that instantly commanded absolute obedience. The flashing emergency lights from the street outside cast long, chaotic shadows across their faces as they marched in a perfect, intimidating formation down the main aisle of the church. The affluent guests, still reeling from the catastrophic public executions they had just witnessed, shoved past one another just to get out of the way, pressing their backs hard against the polished oak pews. As the tactical unit approached the altar, the bold, bright yellow letters printed on the backs of their jackets became unmistakably readable. These weren't regular NYPD beat cops responding to a public disturbance. These were agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agent in charge, a tall, imposing man with a grim, deeply lined face, completely ignored the terrified guests and headed straight for the marble platform where Marcus and I stood. Marcus gave him a brief, knowing nod, a subtle gesture of professional recognition that sent another shockwave of realization through the breathless crowd. This raid was not a spontaneous reaction to the documents displayed on the giant screens above us. This was a meticulously coordinated law enforcement operation. Marcus and I hadn't just sent an anonymous email to the authorities an hour before the ceremony. An entire week prior, we had walked directly into the federal building, personally handing the massive, uncensored forensic audit report straight to the white-collar crime division. FBI agents spent the last 7 days verifying the ledgers, obtaining the necessary federal warrants, and quietly drafting federal arrest warrants. Embezzling funds from a registered national charity, an organization subsidized by state and federal grants that wasn't a local misdemeanor handled by a municipal judge. This was a massive, high-priority federal crime, carrying the threat of decades in federal prison and drawing the immediate, wrathful gaze of the highest state authorities. We had simply provided the FBI agents with the perfect, enclosed location to execute their arrest warrants, ensuring my family would suffer maximum, unavoidable social destruction. The lead agent pointed to the 2 private bodyguards, who still held Catherine pinned flat to the cold stone floor. At his silent command, my men smoothly backed away, transferring control of the disgraced socialite directly into the hands of federal authorities. 2 agents roughly hauled my mother to her feet. The fight had finally left her, giving way to a hollowed-out terror. Her custom designer dress was torn at the shoulder, stained with dust from the historic floor, and her carefully styled hair hung in a chaotic, sweaty tangle over her panicked face. The commander read her Miranda rights in a loud, monotonous drone that carried through the deathly silent church, officially charging her with multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and multi-million-dollar embezzlement. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, tightening firmly around her wrists, sounded like the final, loud slam of a cell door. This time, Catherine didn't scream or fight. The reality of cold steel biting into her skin completely broke her psyche, leaving her nothing but a trembling, hyperventilating shell of the terrifying matron she once was. Just a few yards away, another pair of agents approached the front pew, where Chloe was still curled in a pathetic, tear-stained ball. She flinched violently as they grabbed her by the arms, hauling her off the floor. She sobbed incoherently, shaking her head and begging Marcus to tell them it was all a mistake, desperately looking for salvation from the man who had just handed her divorce papers. Marcus simply looked away, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket with an expression of absolute, blood-curdling indifference. The agents spun Chloe around, twisting her arms behind her back, and secured her wrists with a second pair of steel handcuffs. The sight of the spoiled, arrogant golden child being shackled in her own extravagant maid-of-honor dress was a portrait of absolute, undeniable ruin. Mascara ran in thick black streams down her cheeks, and her perfectly manicured nails scratched uselessly against the heavy metal cuffs. The agents turned the 2 disgraced women around and began the long, agonizing march back down the main aisle. It was the exact same path they had proudly strutted down just an hour earlier, completely convinced of their untouchable superiority. Now, it was a truly harrowing walk of shame. The Manhattan elite, the exact same people Catherine had manipulated for decades and so desperately wanted to impress, looked at them with expressions of pure, untainted disgust. Old friends, business partners, and gala co-chairs ostensibly turned their backs, refusing to make eye contact with the common thieves being paraded through the sanctuary like trophies. The whispers and gasps coming from the pews were no longer filled with shock, but absolute revulsion. The complete rejection by their peers was a social death sentence, executed in real time, under the glare of the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked outside. At the foot of the altar, private security finally stepped away from Connor, releasing their heavy grip on his shoulders. The agents completely ignored him as they escorted my mother and sister out of the building. Connor was not part of the federal investigation into charity fraud, but his freedom offered absolutely no salvation. He remained crumpled on the cold marble floor, completely alone, sobbing pitifully into his hands as the heavy oak doors slammed shut, sealing the fate of the women he conspired with. He was a financially ruined, thoroughly broken wreck of a man, crushed under the weight of millions of dollars in toxic debt, left to rot in the wreckage of his own towering greed. As the crowd simply watched him fall to pieces, the boom of the heavy oak cathedral doors closing, cutting off Connor's pathetic, echoing sobs, was the final, decisive sound of my old life. I didn't look back. I walked down the stone steps into the crisp New York afternoon, leaving the wreckage of their greed entirely behind me. Exactly 365 days later, the stifling air of that church was nothing more than a distant memory, completely replaced by the crisp, salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean. I stood on the edge of the bright, sun-drenched cliffs of Carmel, California, my toes sinking into the warm, golden sand of a private beachfront deck. The endless expanse of the ocean stretched out before me, shimmering in a brilliant sapphire blue that reflected the absolute clarity of my new existence. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, expanding my lungs to their absolute limits. The air tasted like sea salt and pine trees. It was clean and full of life. There was no more pain, no more monstrous fatigue. There was only the vibrant, pulsing rhythm of a perfectly healthy body. My oncologist had handed me the final, conclusive blood and scan results just 2 weeks prior. The results were indisputable. I was in 100% remission, the shadow that once hung over my future. That terrifying diagnosis that my so-called family tried with such zeal to weaponize for their own financial gain had been completely eradicated. I was no longer a patient, and I certainly was no longer a victim. I opened my eyes and ran a hand over my head, smiling at the touch of the ocean breeze against my skin. For months, I suffocated under hot, scratchy, masking wigs, playing the role of the fading, tragic, invalid, just to make Connor and Catherine feel completely comfortable in their delusions. I burned every single one of those synthetic prisons the day I flew to California. Now, I wore a chic, natural, short pixie cut. It was edgy, elegant, and completely devoid of guilt. It framed my face not as a badge of past illness, but as a striking crown of survival and absolute rebirth. I wasn't hiding from anyone anymore. I walked across the smooth cedar planks of my spacious deck, feeling the morning sun warm my skin, and picked up a tablet from the table. Marcus, who smoothly transitioned from my forensic auditor to the chief financial officer of my newly founded tech company, had sent me his weekly briefing. Tucked beneath impressive quarterly projections for the integration of my medical algorithms with national hospital networks was a personalized digital news clipping. Marcus always made sure I was up to date on the ongoing fallout from those events in New York. The U.S. justice system moved with relentless, unforgiving speed. The massive, perfectly documented forensic audit Marcus and I handed to federal investigators left absolutely no room for negotiations or plea deals with the U.S. attorney. Catherine and Chloe's trial was a spectacular, highly publicized media circus. The Manhattan elite, the same people my mother ruthlessly climbed over her entire adult life to ensure social dominance, treated the trial like a major sporting event. They packed the courtroom to the brim just to watch the mighty fall. Catherine tried to maintain her aristocratic haughtiness in the courtroom right up until the moment the judge read the verdict. She and Chloe were convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement of charity funds, and massive tax evasion. The judge commented with disgust on their systematic theft from a foundation designed to help terminally ill children, handing down maximum federal sentences without the possibility of early parole. My mother and sister, women who once defined their worth by designer handbags and the exclusivity of their zip code, were now serving out their decades-long sentences at a federal correctional institution on the outskirts of the tri-state area. They were stripped of their designer gowns and heavy diamond jewelry, forced to wear identical, ill-fitting prison scrubs. But the loss of freedom was only half their punishment. The court ordered massive, crushing financial restitution penalties to the foundation. Every single legitimate asset they owned was seized by the IRS and auctioned off by the federal government. The sprawling suburban estate, the luxury vehicles, the offshore accounts, all of it was liquidated. They were completely stripped of their livelihoods, forced to work menial prison jobs for pennies, and their glittering social empire turned to absolute dust. Connor's fate, meticulously detailed in the second half of Marcus's report, was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. His desperate, frantic attempts to void the prenuptial agreement in civil court ended in spectacular failure. The judge took one look at the binding liability clauses Connor so arrogantly signed without reading and upheld the contract in its entirety. Connor was legally shackled to multi-million-dollar toxic debt generated by his own disastrous business mistakes. His hedge fund was immediately liquidated. State regulators from the SEC and aggressive creditors descended on his firm like vultures, seizing his penthouse, sports cars, and frozen bank accounts. But that liquidation covered only a fraction of what he owed. The remaining balance, the giant, suffocating mountain of debt I had bought up through my anonymous shell company, remained firmly attached to his personal Social Security number. To satisfy the aggressive court-ordered wage garnishments dictated by my holding company, Connor was now forced to take grueling minimum wage work. The former titan of Wall Street finance, the man who once sneered at the working class from the balcony of his luxury penthouse, was currently employed as a night shift warehouse stalker in a massive, windowless logistics center on the outskirts of the city. He spent his nights scanning barcodes and moving heavy boxes in a drafty concrete facility, wearing a cheap, synthetic uniform. Every Friday, the moment his pathetic paycheck hit his account, the bank automatically garnished 80% of his earnings directly into my corporation's accounts. He was trapped in an endless cycle of exhausting physical labor, living in a cramped studio apartment, working solely to pay off a debt to the woman he had tried to discard. I locked the tablet screen and placed it back on the table, feeling a deep, calm sense of closure on that chapter. The scales were completely balanced. They were trapped in pathetic cages they built themselves out of their own greed, while I stood in the golden light of the California sun, breathing in the ocean air, my entire life stretching out before me brilliantly and infinitely free. I turned away from the endless, shimmering expanse of the Pacific Ocean. As the cool coastal breeze played with the short, textured strands of my pixie cut, I stepped away from the edge of the cliff and walked barefoot back across the smooth cedar planks of the deck, eventually stepping onto a manicured stone path that led away from the private beach. I wasn't heading to an isolated retirement sanctuary, nor to a quiet place of convalescence. I was walking straight toward the towering, triumphant culmination of my life's work. Rising majestically against the bright California sky stood a breathtaking, ultra-modern structure of sprawling steel and soaring glass walls. It was a marvel of contemporary architecture, completely transparent and brilliantly illuminated by the morning sun. This was the newly opened headquarters of the Maggie H. Advanced Medical Technology Foundation. The astronomical $140 million from the sale of my diagnostic algorithm didn't just fund the absolute ruin of my enemies. It laid the concrete and steel foundations for this sprawling research campus. The building was designed with deliberate transparency, a stark, intentional rejection of the shadows, secrets, and deceptions that suffocated my previous life in New York. Here, behind these massive walls of clear glass, brilliant minds gathered to develop next-generation oncology software dedicated to detecting deadly diseases years before they could become a death sentence for anyone else. A large crowd of esteemed medical researchers, top-tier programmers, and local dignitaries had gathered on the pristine emerald green lawn in front of the building. A thick, bright red silk ribbon was stretched tightly across the main entrance, fluttering slightly in the steady ocean breeze. The atmosphere was electric, buzzing with genuine anticipation and a shared purpose. Right next to the brass stanchions, holding a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors, stood Marcus. He looked absolutely impeccable in a sharp, tailored navy suit, the California sun catching the silver of his watch as he checked the time. He caught my eye as I approached and sent me a smile so wide and genuine that it radiated pure joy. He was no longer just the brilliant, calculating forensic auditor who engineered the spectacular legal and financial downfall of my former fiancé. He was officially the CFO of my new foundation, my most trusted confidant, and without a shadow of a doubt, my closest friend. We had navigated the absolute darkest trenches of corporate sabotage, legal threats, and familial betrayal together. We built a bond forged in the fire of righteous revenge and absolute loyalty. He stood by me when I was a bald, exhausted woman plotting a hostile takeover from a hospital bed, and he stood by me now as a titan of the medical tech industry. I stepped up to the podium set up just behind the crimson ribbon. The cultured, enthusiastic applause of the gathered crowd washed over me like a wave. It was a beautiful, resonant sound, a stark and total contrast to the horrified, suffocating gasps that echoed in the cavernous nave of that cathedral exactly a year ago. Marcus stepped forward, handing me the heavy silver scissors. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a warm, private whisper meant only for me. He said that I had earned every single second of this victory, and that the world finally gets a chance to see the real me. I took the heavy scissors, the cool metal grounding me firmly in the reality of the present moment. I looked out at the brilliant assembly of professionals before me, people who were ready to change the world, and then I caught my own reflection in the massive glass doors of the foundation. For so long, I equated my womanhood, my inherent worth, and my basic humanity with the long, flowing hair I lost to illness. I cowered under suffocating synthetic wigs, terrified that the world would look at my bare, smooth head and see nothing but a broken, defective creature marked with the stigma of death. I believed the cruel, whispered insults of my mother and sister, internalizing the belief that my illness made me unattractive and weak. But now, staring at my sharp, natural reflection, I finally understood this profound, undeniable truth. Losing my hair never made me any less of a woman. It simply acted as a ruthless, infallible filter. It stripped away that superficial armor and exposed the hideous, shallow monsters lurking in my own home. My illness didn't diminish me at all. It merely illuminated the parasitic greed of the people I was told to love since childhood. Connor, Catherine, and Chloe looked at my diagnosis and saw nothing but a convenient expiration date, a fast track to unearned fortune. They treated my impending death as a lucrative financial gain, plotting how to use my tragedy for their own benefit. The day Connor screamed his vile rejection at the altar, intending to humiliate me in front of the most powerful New York elite, was never the tragedy I initially feared. In reality, it was the greatest, most profound blessing of my entire existence. That brutal, highly public abandonment was not a heartbreak. It was a radical, life-saving surgery. It was the precise, surgical removal of a massive, toxic tumor masquerading as my family and future husband. By cutting them off legally and financially, by excising their narcissism and greed from my life, I cured myself of a disease far deadlier than any physical ailment I had ever faced. I placed the sharp blades of the ceremonial scissors around the thick red silk. I felt not a single ounce of regret for the total destruction I left behind in New York. The people who tried to bury me were now buried in cages they built themselves, while I stood in the light. I squeezed the handles with absolute certainty. The heavy blade cleanly snipped the fabric, severing the ribbon with a satisfying, resonant snap. The crowd erupted into loud, joyful cheers, the happy noise blending perfectly with the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves behind me. I handed the scissors back to Marcus and smiled with a genuine expression of absolute freedom, stepping through the open glass doors. The toxic infection was completely gone. Finally, I was truly ready to live. Maggie's powerful story of triumph teaches us a profound lesson about self-worth and the true definition of family. Often, the people who should protect and love us unconditionally are the very ones most blinded by greed and superficiality. Maggie's journey perfectly illustrates that being abandoned by toxic people is not a tragic loss, but rather a necessary, life-saving operation. It clears the path to genuine healing and allows us to surround ourselves with loyal people who truly value us for exactly who we are, not what we can provide for them. If this story moved you, leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Let me know in the comments below if you've also had the experience of breaking free from a toxic relationship and how you found your freedom.